They told her no. The conductor's eyes were cold as he turned his back on the desperate widow, clutching her last dollar. Margaret Hale's teaching job had evaporated like morning dew, and with it, her final hope of survival in the brutal Arizona territory of 1878. The train's whistle screamed, her last chance departing forever. Then hoofbeats. A stranger's voice, low and certain. "I've been waiting for you." But before we discover who this mysterious cowboy is and why fate brought them together, I invite you to journey with me through this tale of loss, courage, and unexpected love. Comment below what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin where all great transformations start, at the very bottom, with a woman who had nothing left to lose. The Arizona sun hung like a brass coin in a bleached sky, and Margaret Hale stood on the Cedar Springs train platform with the certain knowledge that she was about to become invisible. She had felt it happening for weeks now, this slow erasure of her existence. First, when Thomas died, coughing blood into their wedding quilt until his lungs finally surrendered to the consumption that had been eating him alive for 2 years. Then, when the bank took their small house in St. Louis, the one with the yellow roses she'd planted the week after their wedding. And now, standing here with her entire life compressed into a single worn carpet bag, she could feel herself disappearing completely, becoming just another piece of western dust that nobody bothered to notice. "Ma'am, I've told you 3 times now." The conductor's voice carried the particular irritation of a man who believed his patience was a gift he bestowed rather than a basic human courtesy. "Your ticket was for yesterday's train. Yesterday. This here's Thursday's run, and you ain't got passage for Thursday." Margaret's fingers tightened on the letter in her pocket, the one from the Tucson School District promising her a teaching position, promising her salvation, promising her a reason to keep drawing breath. The letter that had arrived 2 days after Thomas's funeral, when she'd been sitting in the empty parlor, wondering if there was enough left of her to bother continuing. "Please," she said, and hated the tremor in her voice, hated how small she sounded, how desperate. "I can pay the difference. I have—" She fumbled with her reticule, extracting the coins one by one, counting them in her palm like a child displaying treasures that only she found valuable. "I have $2.37. Surely that's enough to—" Full fare to Tucson is $8.50. The conductor didn't even look at her outstretched hand. He was already turning away, his brass buttons catching the merciless sunlight. "Rules are rules, ma'am. You want to argue with rules? You write to the railroad company. Me? I just work here." Around her, other passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes sliding away from her shame with practiced ease. A well-dressed woman in a traveling suit of deep burgundy clutched her daughter closer, as though desperation might be contagious. 2 businessmen in suits that probably cost more than Margaret's entire trousseau studied the platform's weathered boards with sudden fascination. A rancher in dusty denim simply stepped around her, his spurs jingling a small song of indifference. This was how it happened, she realized. This was how people fell through the cracks of the world. Not with drama or tragedy, but with this. With strangers looking away. With rules mattering more than human need. With the slow accumulation of small abandonments until you simply cease to exist. The train hissed and groaned, its great iron bulk trembling with readiness. Steam billowed from beneath its wheels like breath from some mechanical dragon, and Margaret felt something break inside her chest. Not cleanly, not mercifully, but in jagged pieces that tore on their way down. She had been 23 years old when she married Thomas Hale. He'd been a clerk with gentle hands and dreams of opening a bookshop, and she'd been a school teacher who believed that love and determination could overcome anything. They'd had 4 years together, 4 years of modest happiness, of shared books and Sunday walks, of planning for children who would never come. Then the coughing started. Then the blood. Then the slow, horrible erosion of the man she loved, until Thomas Hale was nothing but translucent skin stretched over prominent bones, his eyes apologizing for dying even as he clutched her hand and tried to pretend he wasn't terrified. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered at the end. "Margaret, I'm so sorry." As though dying were something he'd chosen, as though leaving her alone and penniless in a world that had no use for childless widows was a personal failing rather than simple, cruel biology. The funeral had cost $73, money she didn't have, money she'd borrowed from the church with promises she had no idea how to keep. The headstone was simple granite with his name and dates, nothing about who he'd been or what he'd meant, because words cost extra and she'd already sold everything of value they'd owned. The house went next. Then her mother's cameo brooch, the only thing she had from her own family. Then her wedding ring, which she'd removed with trembling fingers and placed in the pawnbroker's palm, feeling Thomas's ghost recoil from the indignity, even as she whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The letter from Tucson had been a miracle. A teaching position, room and board included, starting salary of $40 a month. It wasn't much, but it was everything. A chance to rebuild, to be useful again, to have purpose beyond simply surviving another day. Except she'd missed yesterday's train because Mrs. Henderson's daughter had given birth early and Margaret had been the only woman close enough to help. She'd spent the night boiling water and tearing sheets into strips, holding the girl's hand through contractions that seemed to go on forever, whispering encouragement until finally, a baby's cry had split the darkness. The girl had lived. The baby had lived. And Margaret had arrived at the station exactly 24 hours too late for her miracle. "All aboard!" The conductor's voice rang across the platform like a judge pronouncing sentence. "Cedar Springs to Tucson, all aboard." Passengers began flowing toward the train. The burgundy woman and her daughter, the businessmen, the rancher, all of them moving with the easy confidence of people whose tickets were in order, whose lives were proceeding according to plan. The world had a place for them. The world had forgotten Margaret entirely. She stood there, carpetbag at her feet, and felt the full weight of her isolation. No family. Her parents had died of influenza when she was 16. Her only sister had moved to Boston with her merchant husband and stopped writing 2 years ago. No friends. Not really. Just acquaintances from the church who'd brought covered dishes after Thomas died and then gratefully returned to their own lives. No money, no prospects, no home. Nothing. The train's whistle shrieked and Margaret flinched as though the sound were a physical blow. The platform was nearly empty now, just her and an old Mexican man sweeping tobacco ash into small piles that the wind immediately redistributed. He glanced at her once, his dark eyes infinitely sad, infinitely knowing, and then returned to his pointless task. She should move. She should pick up her bag and walk away before the humiliation became even more complete. But where? The boarding house where she'd spent last night had been paid through this morning. She had no money for another night, no money for anything except perhaps a meal or two before starvation became something she'd have to consider seriously. The train lurched forward, its wheels screaming against the rails. Margaret watched it begin to move, taking with it her last chance at a life that mattered, taking with it the person she might have been, Miss Hale, the teacher, beloved by her students, respected by the community, useful and needed and real. That woman was disappearing down the tracks now, dissolving into the shimmering heat of the Arizona morning, becoming nothing but another story that almost was. Then she heard them. Hoofbeats. Not the usual scattered clop of a single rider, but something steadier, more purposeful. The sound cut through the train's fading rumble like a knife through cloth, and despite herself, Margaret turned to look. He emerged from the heat shimmer like something conjured from a dime novel. A cowboy on a dark bay horse, both of them layered with the fine dust of hard travel. The man sat his saddle with the unconscious grace of someone who'd been born to it, his body moving with the horse's rhythm as though they were parts of the same organism. As he drew closer, details emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the practical clothes of a working cattleman, worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, leather chaps scarred with use, a hat that had seen weather and sun, and probably more than a few storms. His face was shadowed beneath the hat's brim, but she caught an impression of strong features, a jaw dark with several days' stubble, and eyes that were scanning the platform with definite purpose. Those eyes found her and stopped. The cowboy dismounted in a single fluid motion, the reins falling naturally into his hand as his boots hit the platform with a solid thunk. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a bit older. The sun made ages hard to read in this country. He moved toward her with the slightly bow-legged walk of a man who spent more time on horseback than on his own feet, and as he came closer, she saw that his face was weathered but kind. His eyes, now visible beneath the hat brim, were a startling pale blue, and his expression carried something she couldn't quite identify. Recognition. "Mrs. Hale?" His voice was low, rough-edged but not harsh, carrying the slow drawl of Texas or perhaps Oklahoma. He stopped a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and deeply courteous. "Margaret Hale." She stared at him, her mind fumbling for purchase. How did the stranger know her name? Had the railroad sent someone to... No, that made no sense. Had the church... But she'd told no one where she was going. There'd been no one to tell. Yes. Her voice came out hoarse, unused. "I'm Margaret Hale, but I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage, Mr. Pierce." He smiled then, just a slight curve of his mouth, but it transformed his face from merely weathered to something approaching handsome. "Rowan Pierce, and I've been waiting for you, ma'am." The words hung in the superheated air between them, impossible and absurd. Waiting for her. This stranger had been waiting for her, as though she were someone worth waiting for, someone whose arrival mattered. "I don't understand." Margaret heard the tremor returning to her voice, felt the hot sting of tears threatening behind her eyes. She was so tired of not understanding, of being adrift in circumstances she couldn't control or comprehend. "We've never met. How could you possibly—" "No, ma'am. We haven't met, not formally anyway." Rowan Pierce's voice remained gentle, as though he understood how close she was to breaking and was taking care not to push her over the edge. "But I know who you are. Or rather, Mrs. Hawkins knows. She sent me to fetch you." Mrs. Hawkins? The name meant nothing. Margaret shook her head, feeling unmoored, as though she'd stumbled into someone else's story. "I'm afraid I don't know any Mrs. Hawkins. There must be some mistake." "No mistake, ma'am." He reached into his shirt pocket and extracted a letter, its edges worn from travel, but the paper still crisp enough to be recent. "Here. She wrote you as well, but I reckon that letter's chasing you instead of finding you." Things get complicated when plans change quick. Margaret took the letter with trembling fingers, unfolding it to reveal a woman's neat, confident handwriting. "Dear Mrs. Hale, you don't know me, but I know something of you. My name is Constance Hawkins, and I own a ranch in Whispering Pines, a small town in the Mogollon Rim country, about 3 days' ride north of where you are now. I received a telegram yesterday from my cousin Beatrice in Tucson. She's on the school board there, and she told me about a difficult decision they'd been forced to make. Apparently the board had promised you a teaching position, but the town's primary benefactor, a man named Aldrich who owns the copper mine, decided he didn't want his children taught by a woman who, in his words, couldn't even keep her husband alive. I won't waste ink condemning Aldrich's cruelty, though it deserves condemnation. Instead, I'll tell you this. Whispering Pines needs a teacher desperately. We have 19 children and no school, and I've been teaching them myself in my barn when ranch work allows, which isn't often enough. We can't pay what Tucson was offering, only $30 a month, but we can provide a small house, meals, and a community that judges people by their character, not their misfortunes. I'm sending my best man, Rowan Pierce, to meet your train and bring you here if you're willing. He's thoroughly trustworthy, and I'd stake my life on his integrity. The choice is entirely yours, of course, but if you need a place where you can start fresh, where you'll be valued for what you can give rather than pitied for what you've lost, Whispering Pines might be exactly where you need to be. The position is yours if you want it. Rowan will bring you safely to us. With respect and hope, Constance Hawkins." Margaret read the letter twice, then a third time, her mind struggling to process its contents. Someone had been watching out for her. Someone she'd never met had learned of her humiliation, and instead of looking away like everyone else, had reached out a hand. "I don't—" She looked up at Rowan Pierce, the stranger who'd been sent to rescue her. "Why would Mrs. Hawkins do this? She doesn't know me. How does she even know I'm—" She couldn't finish the sentence. How did this woman know she was trustworthy, suitable, worth saving? Mrs. Hawkins has a way of knowing things. Rowan's expression held something that might have been admiration or perhaps simple respect. She reads people like you'd read a book, sees what's there instead of what folks pretend is there. Her cousin Beatrice wired her about what happened at that school board meeting, how that Aldrich fellow carried on, how you'd already given up your home and traveled all this way. Mrs. Hawkins don't abide cruelty, especially cruelty dressed up as propriety. He paused, his pale eyes holding hers with an intensity that felt like being seen, really seen, for the first time in months. She told me to tell you something else, something she didn't put in the letter. She said to say, we're all running from something or toward something, and sometimes those are the same thing. Whispering Pines is where people go when they need the world to give them another chance. Come take yours. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, but this time it wasn't breaking. It was opening to let in a sliver of something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Hope. The train's gone, she said stupidly, stating the obvious because her mind couldn't quite grasp what was being offered. I missed it. I have no way to get to Tucson now, and even if I did, you don't want to go to Tucson, ma'am. Not now, not after how they treated you. Rowan's voice was firm but kind. A town that judges a widow for being widowed ain't a town worth living in. But Whispering Pines, that's different. That's a place where folks understand that life kicks you in the teeth sometimes, and what matters is whether you get back up, not whether you ever got knocked down. Behind him, his horse shifted weight, its tack creaking softly. The Mexican man had stopped sweeping and was watching them with undisguised interest, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I have a wagon waiting just down the street, Rowan continued, gesturing vaguely toward the town beyond the platform. Good team of horses, supplies for the journey, and a bedroll all made up. It's about 3 days' travel, maybe a bit less if the weather holds and the roads are decent. I know it's asking a lot, trusting a stranger. But Mrs. Hawkins figured you might not have a lot of other options right now, and she wanted to make sure you knew there was at least one door still open. 3 days on the road with a man she'd never met, traveling to a place she'd never heard of, to take a job that paid less than the one she'd lost. It was madness. It was reckless. It was everything she'd been taught a proper woman should never even consider. But proper hadn't saved her. Careful hadn't saved her. Following all the rules and doing everything right hadn't kept Thomas alive, or kept the bank from taking their home, or kept the Tucson school board from deciding she was damaged goods. Maybe it was time to stop being proper. How do I know? She stopped, recognizing the question as foolish even as she asked it. How did she know she could trust him? She didn't. How did she know this wasn't some elaborate trick? She didn't. How did she know Mrs. Hawkins was who she claimed to be, and Whispering Pines was anything more than a pretty name for a place that might be even worse than here? She didn't know any of it, but she knew what happened if she stayed. Nothing. The empty nothing of another night with no place to sleep, another day with no purpose, another week of invisible erosion until there was nothing left of Margaret Hale except a name in a ledger somewhere, a woman who died without anyone bothering to notice or care. You know what, ma'am? You don't know. Rowan's voice was gentle, but it held an edge of something else. Understanding, perhaps. Recognition of the impossible position she was in. And I can't give you guarantees. All I can tell you is this. Mrs. Hawkins is the finest woman I've ever known, and she wouldn't have sent me to fetch you if she didn't mean every word in that letter. And He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I give you my word as a man who's still trying to figure out how to be decent in a world that don't make it easy. I'll see you safely to Whispering Pines, and if when you get there you decide it ain't what you want, I'll bring you right back here, or take you anywhere else you need to go. No questions, no judgment, no debt owed. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, past the weathered face and the trail dust, past the obvious strength in his shoulders and the competent way he held himself. She looked at his eyes, those pale blue eyes that met hers without flinching, without demanding, without trying to convince her of anything except his own sincerity. She'd spent 2 years watching Thomas die, and she'd learned something about human nature in that time. She'd learned that some people met suffering with lies, pretty lies designed to comfort, but lies nonetheless. And some people met it with truth, even when the truth was hard and offered no guarantees. Rowan Pierce looked like a man who told the truth. All right, she heard herself say, and felt the word reshape reality around her. All right, I'll come with you. His smile was like sunrise, slow, warm, transforming. Good, he said simply. Then he bent and picked up her carpet bag as though it weighed nothing, as though carrying a stranger's worldly possessions was something he did every day and considered an honor rather than an imposition. "Town's this way," he said, gesturing with his free hand. "Wagon's at the livery stable. It ain't fancy, but I made sure to get some cushions for the seat, and there's a canopy to keep the sun off. Mrs. Hawkins would skin me alive if I brought you back looking like a piece of jerky." Despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the sheer absurdity of the situation, Margaret felt a small laugh escape her throat. It sounded rusty, unpracticed, but real. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than she'd ever meant anything. "Mr. Pierce, Just Rowan, ma'am. Ain't nobody called me Mr. Pierce since the judge sentenced me to—" He stopped abruptly, and for just a moment something that might have been old pain flickered across his face. "Well, that's a story for another time if you still want to hear it after you've known me longer. Point is, I ain't much for formality." "Then you should call me Margaret." She fell into step beside him, leaving the platform and its humiliations behind. "If we're going to spend 3 days traveling together, we might as well be comfortable." They walked through Cedar Springs, a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings that looked like they'd been assembled hastily and might blow away just as quickly. A saloon, a general store, a hotel that had probably never seen better days. People moved along the wooden sidewalks with purpose, their eyes sliding over Margaret and Rowan without interest or curiosity. She was leaving this place, she realized, leaving this station where she'd been rejected, this town where nobody knew her name or cared about her story. In 3 days, she'd be somewhere new, a place called Whispering Pines, where apparently widows weren't judged for surviving and where someone she'd never met had decided she was worth saving. It felt like being born again, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The livery stable sat at the far end of town, a weathered structure that smelled of hay and horse and leather. Inside, Rowan's wagon waited, a sturdy farm wagon with high sides and a canvas canopy stretched over wooden hoops. Just as he'd promised, cushions had been arranged on the seat, and she could see supplies secured in the back, canvas-wrapped bundles that suggested careful preparation. "Let me help you up," Rowan said, setting her carpet bag gently in the wagon bed before turning to offer his hand. Margaret hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid, and his grip was firm but careful as he helped her onto the seat. Once she was settled, he retrieved his horse, the dark bay she'd first seen him riding, and tied it to the back of the wagon. "That's Ranger," he said, patting the horse's neck with obvious affection. "Best cow pony I've ever had. He'll follow along easy enough, and if we run into trouble, I can switch from the wagon to him quick." "Trouble?" Margaret heard the tremor in her voice. "What kind of trouble?" "Likely none at all," Rowan said, swinging himself up onto the seat beside her with practiced ease. "But this is still wild country, and it pays to be prepared. We got bandits sometimes, though not usually on the main roads, and the Apache have been quiet for a while, but you never know. Mostly I'm just planning for the usual, a thrown wheel, a storm, maybe a snake spooking the horses. Nothing to worry about, just things to be ready for." He gathered the reins, clicking softly to the team, 2 sturdy horses, one gray and one sorrel, both looking well-fed and well cared for. The wagon lurched forward, wheels creaking as they rolled out of the stable's dim interior into the blazing afternoon sunlight. "You comfortable?" Rowan asked, glancing at her. "Those cushions helping any?" "Yes, thank you." Margaret arranged her skirts, suddenly aware of how threadbare they were, how the hem was coming loose, how the fabric had faded from respectable black to something closer to gray. Widow's weeds were supposed to be dignified, but hers just looked poor. "You've been very thoughtful." "Just trying to make the journey as easy as I can. It's a long way, and I know you've already had a hard day." He guided the team onto the main road heading north, the wagon settling into a steady rhythm. "We'll make good time before sunset, then camp for the night. I brought extra blankets, and there's food enough for a week if we need it, though we should make Whispering Pines in 3 days easy." They rode in silence for a while, the town falling away behind them as the road stretched into open country. The landscape was harsh and beautiful, red rock formations rising from scrubland, distant mountains purple against the sky, and everywhere the endless sweep of land that made humans seem very small and very temporary. Margaret found herself studying Rowan from the corner of her eye. He handled the team with unconscious skill, his attention on the road but his body relaxed, comfortable. There was something peaceful about him, she thought, something settled, as though he'd made peace with whatever demons he carried and learned to live alongside them. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, breaking the silence. "Yes, ma'am." "Margaret, ask whatever you like." "That thing you said back at the station about the judge, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but—" She paused, wondering if she was being rude, but needing to know. "What did you mean?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon. Then he sighed, the sound carrying years of old regret. "Fair question, and you got a right to know who you're traveling with. Short version is, I spent 2 years in Yuma Territorial Prison for horse theft." He said it without inflection, just stating a fact. "I was 19, stupid, and running with a bad crowd. We stole horses from a ranch outside of Tucson, figured we'd sell them across the border and split the profit. Got caught before we made it 10 miles. Margaret's breath caught. A horse thief. She was traveling alone with a convicted horse thief. Every warning she'd ever received about men and danger suddenly rang in her ears like church bells. But Rowan continued, his voice steady. "Judge gave me 5 years. I served 2 before Mrs. Hawkins came to the prison looking for ranch hands. She had this program. She'd take convicts who wanted to go straight and give them work, give them a chance. Most of the ranchers in the territory thought she was crazy, but she said she didn't care what a man had been, only what he wanted to be." He glanced at Margaret then, his pale eyes meeting hers directly. "I've been working for her 6 years now. Haven't stolen so much as a loose nail in all that time. She trusted me when nobody else would, and I'd rather die than betray that trust. That's why when she asked me to come get you, to bring you safe to Whispering Pines, I said yes without hesitation. Because Mrs. Hawkins doesn't ask things of people unless she knows they'll do right by them." Margaret sat very still, processing this information. A horse thief. But also a man who'd served his time, who'd been given a chance and taken it, who'd spent 6 years proving himself reliable. A man who told her the truth, even when a lie would have been easier. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, "for being honest. Figured you had a right to know." Rowan's expression eased slightly. "If you want to turn back, I understand. I can take you back to Cedar Springs right now. No hard feelings." Margaret thought about it, really thought about it. About the risk, the uncertainty, the sheer impropriety of traveling alone with a man she'd just met, a man with a criminal past. Every rule of decent society screamed at her to demand he turn around immediately. But society hadn't saved Thomas. Society hadn't saved their home. Society hadn't saved her from standing on that platform being invisible while the train pulled away from her last chance. "No," she said quietly. "Keep going. I think I'd like to see Whispering Pines after all." Rowan's smile was small but genuine. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the chance." They rode on as the sun began its long descent toward the western mountains. The road wound through increasingly wild country, past groves of juniper and pinon, across dry washes where flash floods had carved intricate patterns in the red earth, through stands of palo verde that cast minimal shade and looked like they'd been designed by someone who didn't understand what trees were supposed to be. After a while, Rowan began pointing out landmarks, his voice taking on the cadence of a man who loved the land he lived in. "That peak there, the one that looks like a broken tooth? That's Saddle Mountain. Good landmark. You can see it from almost anywhere in the territory. And that valley we're heading toward, that's where the real beauty starts. Pines start about 20 miles north of here, and once you hit them, everything changes. Cooler, greener, more water. Whispering Pines sits right at the edge where desert meets mountain forest. Best of both worlds, Mrs. Hawkins always says." "Have you lived there long?" Margaret asked, grateful for conversation to fill the vast spaces around them. 6 years, like I said. Came straight from Yuma to Whispering Pines and haven't left except for supply runs and cattle drives. It's home now, more home than anywhere I lived before prison." He was quiet a moment, then added, "My family, my real family, they were back in Texas. My brother and I, we came west together after the war. He died in a mining accident outside of Prescott. That's when I went bad for a while, after losing him. Figured nothing mattered anymore, so I might as well take what I wanted. I'm sorry about your brother, Margaret said softly. Me too. He was the better man between us, that's for certain. Rowan's voice carried old grief, worn smooth by time but never quite forgotten. His name was Sam. He used to say that the West was where men went to become better versions of themselves. Guess I took the long way around to proving him right. They fell into comfortable silence again, and Margaret found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of her situation. There was something fundamentally decent about Rowan Pierce, something that transcended his past mistakes. He'd been broken and rebuilt himself, and the scars of that rebuilding showed in the careful way he spoke, the thoughtful way he moved, the obvious gratitude he carried for being given a second chance. She understood that. She was broken too, after all. Maybe Whispering Pines was where broken people went to heal. The sun was touching the horizon when Rowan guided the wagon off the main road toward a grove of cottonwoods that suggested water nearby. Sure enough, a small spring bubbled up among the rocks, feeding a pool no more than 6 feet across before disappearing back into the earth. Good place to camp, Rowan said, setting the brake and jumping down. Water's sweet here, and there's enough grass for the horses. I'll get everything set up if you want to stretch your legs. Margaret climbed down carefully, her muscles stiff from hours of sitting. The evening air was already cooling rapidly. Desert nights were cold, she'd been warned, and she wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. While she walked the stiffness from her legs, Rowan worked with efficient competence. He unhitched the team and let them drink before hobbling them where they could graze. He untied Ranger and did the same. Then he pulled gear from the wagon, a canvas tarp that he spread on the ground, blankets and bedrolls, a small camp stove, and cooking supplies. You'll sleep here, he said, indicating the space under the wagon where he'd arranged blankets to form a makeshift bed. Canvas on the ground will keep the damp off, and the wagon gives you shelter and privacy. I'll be over there. He gestured to a spot about 20 feet away. By the fire. Close enough to hear if you need anything, far enough to be proper. Thank you, Margaret said, touched by his consideration. What about, necessaries over behind those rocks, he said, understanding her unspoken question. I'll stay by the wagon here while you go, and I'll whistle so you know I'm not going anywhere. Then I'll go, and you can whistle if it makes you feel safer. Mrs. Hawkins was real specific about making sure you felt comfortable. They established the system, both of them slightly embarrassed, but managing the practicalities of wilderness travel. When they were both settled again, Rowan lit a small fire and began preparing a simple meal, beans and bacon, hardtack softened in the bean juice, coffee that smelled like civilization in the wilderness. They ate as the stars emerged, millions of them in a sky so clear it looked polished. Margaret had never seen so many stars. In St. Louis, the city lights had dimmed them, made them distant and faint. Here they seemed close enough to touch, bright enough to read by. Beautiful, ain't it? Rowan said softly, following her gaze. First time I saw a sky like this, I was lying in the prison yard. We used to get an hour outside each day, and I'd spend the whole time looking up. Made me feel like maybe there was something bigger than my mistakes, you know? Something that'd be there long after I was gone. Something that didn't care whether I'd been good or bad, just was. I know what you mean. Margaret surprised herself by speaking. After Thomas died, I used to lie awake at night feeling like I was the only person left in the world, like everyone else was living their lives and I was just stuck, frozen in place while everything moved on without me. That why you took that teaching job in Tucson? To get moving again? Yes. I thought if I could just get away, start fresh somewhere new, I could leave behind the person I'd become. The widow, the failure, the woman everyone pitied. She laughed bitterly. Didn't work out quite how I planned. Sometimes the path ain't straight. Rowan poured more coffee, offering her the cup first before filling his own. Sometimes you got to get knocked down a few more times before you find where you're supposed to land. Maybe Tucson wasn't your destination. Maybe it was just where you needed to be so you'd be standing on that platform when I rode up. Margaret considered this. Was it possible that today's humiliation had been necessary? That being rejected, being stripped of her last plan and her last hope, had opened a door she wouldn't have seen otherwise? It was a strange thought, almost a hopeful one. Tell me about Whispering Pines, she said. What's it really like? Rowan settled back against a rock, his face thoughtful in the firelight. It's small, maybe 60, 70 people all told. Used to be a mining town, silver and copper, but the mines played out about 8 years ago. Most folks left after that, but some stayed. Ranchers mostly, people who'd put down roots and didn't want to pull them up. Mrs. Hawkins came about 10 years ago with her husband. He died 5 years back. Heart gave out. But she stayed, built up the ranch, started hiring people like me who needed a second chance. He paused, gathering his thoughts. It's not fancy. The buildings are mostly wood frame, some adobe. There's a church, a general store, a saloon, a smithy. Doc Carter comes through once a month on his circuit. The school, well, there isn't one really. Mrs. Hawkins has been teaching the kids in her barn when she can, but with the ranch to run and cattle to manage, it ain't regular enough. That's where you come in. 19 children, Margaret said, remembering the letter. That's more than I expected for such a small town. Families out here tend to be big. You got the Morrison clan, 6 kids. The Johnsons have 4. The Santangelo family has 3. Then there's scattered others, ranch hands' kids, children from the Mexican families who stayed after the mines closed. They're hungry for learning, though. When Mrs. Hawkins does manage to hold school, every single one of them shows up, no matter the weather or the work that needs doing. They want better futures, and they know education's how you get there. What about the house? Margaret asked. The letter mentioned a small house. It's actually real nice. Used to belong to the mine superintendent before he pulled out. 2 rooms, wood floor, a real glass window, even a small porch. Mrs. Hawkins has been using it for storage, but she had some of the boys clean it out and fix it up when she decided to get you a proper teacher. There's a bed frame. You'll need a mattress, but we can make one with straw and ticking, and a table and chairs, a stove for cooking and heat. Better than a lot of folks have, honestly. It sounded like a palace to Margaret, who'd been facing the prospect of no home at all. They talked until the fire burned low, Rowan telling her about the people she'd meet. Mrs. Hawkins, of course, but also old Pete, who ran the general store and could fix anything that broke, and Consuelo Martinez, who made the best tortillas in the territory, and Jimmy Two Fingers, who'd lost 2 fingers in a mining accident but could still play guitar better than anyone, and dozens of others who comprised the small, resilient community of Whispering Pines. Finally, when Margaret could barely keep her eyes open, Rowan stood and kicked dirt over the fire. You should get some sleep. Tomorrow's another long day, and the road gets rougher as we head into the highlands. Margaret crawled into her nest of blankets under the wagon, finding it surprisingly comfortable. Above her, the wagon's undercarriage formed a solid roof, and around her the blankets created a cocoon of warmth against the desert night's chill. "Rowan?" she called softly. "Yes, ma'am?" His voice came from the darkness where he'd laid out his own bedroll. "Thank you. For everything. For coming to get me, for being patient with my questions, for making me feel like maybe things might be all right after all." There was a pause, and then his voice came again, warmer this time. "Things will be all right, Margaret. I don't know exactly how yet, but I believe it. Get some rest now. Tomorrow we'll get you closer to home." Home. The word echoed in Margaret's mind as she closed her eyes. She'd thought home was the house in St. Louis with the yellow roses. Then she'd thought it might be Tucson, a place she'd never seen but had pinned all her hopes on. Now home was apparently a small town called Whispering Pines, where a woman she'd never met had decided Margaret was worth saving, and where a reformed horse thief drove a wagon through the wilderness to bring her there safely. It was strange. It was impossible. It was the most hopeful thing that had happened to her in 2 years. As sleep pulled her down, Margaret's last thought was that perhaps the train leaving without her hadn't been the end of her story after all. Perhaps it had only been the beginning. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and the soft sounds of Rowan moving around camp. The sky was still more gray than blue, that pre-dawn hour when the world existed in a state between darkness and light. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling of the wagon's undercarriage above her, by the hard ground beneath her blankets, by the vast silence of the wilderness broken only by the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. Then memory returned. The station, the rejection, the stranger on horseback who'd said he'd been waiting for her. It felt like something from a dream, too strange to be real. But the ache in her back from sleeping on the ground was real enough, and so was the voice that called softly from near the fire. "Morning, Margaret. Coffee's ready when you are. No rush, though. Sun's not even up yet." She emerged from under the wagon, her muscles protesting every movement, her hair undoubtedly a disaster after a night without proper brushing. The desert air was cold enough to make her breath visible, and she wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders as she approached the fire where Rowan was crouched, tending a pan of something that smelled surprisingly good. "Sleep all right?" he asked, glancing up with a slight smile. His hair was damp, and she realized he must have washed at the spring while she slept. The thoughtfulness of it, giving her privacy even when she wasn't aware she needed it, struck her as deeply kind. "Better than I expected, honestly." Margaret accepted the tin cup of coffee he offered, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. "Though I suspect I'll be feeling yesterday's ride for a few days. Gets easier after the first day or two. Your body adjusts." He flipped whatever he was cooking in the pan, some kind of flatbread, she realized. "Got cornmeal cakes here, and there's honey if you want it. Not fancy, but it'll keep us going until we stop for lunch." They ate as the sun began to paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and pink, the kind of sunrise that seemed impossible in its beauty, too vivid to be real. Margaret found herself staring at it, mesmerized by the way the light transformed the landscape from something harsh and alien into something almost magical. "You see many sunrises like this in St. Louis?" Rowan asked, following her gaze. "No, buildings block most of the sky there, and I suppose I was usually too busy to notice even when I could see it." She sipped her coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. "Thomas and I used to talk about traveling someday, seeing the country, but then he got sick, and—" She trailed off, the old grief rising like water in a well. "He'd probably be glad you're seeing it now," Rowan said quietly. "Man loves a woman. He wants her to have good things, even if he can't be there to share them with her." It was such a simple statement, but it carried a weight of understanding that surprised her. She looked at him curiously, wondering what losses had taught him to speak with such certainty about love and letting go. "Were you ever married?" she asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's terribly forward of me." "No, it's all right. And no, never married. Came close once before the war, but she married someone else while I was away fighting. Can't blame her. I was gone 3 years and she needed security. Last I heard, she had 4 children and a farm in East Texas. I hope she's happy." He stood, brushing cornmeal from his hands. "We should get moving if we want to make good distance before the heat sets in. There's a creek about 15 miles north where we can water the horses and rest during the worst of the afternoon." They broke camp with practiced efficiency. Rowan had clearly done this many times before, and Margaret tried to help where she could, learning the rhythms of trail life, how to roll blankets tight enough to fit in the wagon bed, how to check the horses' hooves for stones before hitching them, how to pack supplies so they wouldn't shift and spill during travel. By the time the sun had fully risen, they were back on the road, the wagon creaking steadily northward through country that seemed to grow more beautiful with every mile. The flat desert scrubland gradually gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and piñon. In the distance, mountains rose like promises, their peaks still touched with snow despite the warming season. "Tell me about Mrs. Hawkins," Margaret said after they'd been riding for an hour. "You speak of her with such respect. What's she like?" Rowan was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins as he considered the question. "She's probably the strongest person I've ever met, man or woman. Not just physically strong, though she can work alongside any ranch hand and keep up. But strong in here." He touched his chest over his heart. "She lost her husband, lost the life she thought she'd have, and instead of giving up, she built something better, something that mattered." He guided the team around a particularly rough section of road before continuing. "She's in her 50s now, I reckon, though she'd probably cuff me for saying so. Hair gone mostly gray, face weathered from sun and wind, hands rough as leather. But she's got these eyes, dark brown, almost black, and when she looks at you, you feel like she sees everything. Every mistake you ever made, every regret you carry, every hope you're afraid to name, and somehow she don't judge you for any of it. She just sees who you could be and decides to help you get there." "She sounds remarkable," Margaret said softly. "She is. When she came to Yuma looking for ranch hands, The warden tried to warn her off, said convicts couldn't be trusted, that she was putting herself in danger. She just laughed and said danger was relative, and she'd take her chances with honest criminals over dishonest saints any day. Rowan's smile was full of old fondness. She picked 5 of us that first year, told us straight out that she was giving us a chance, not a guarantee. Work hard, stay honest, and we'd always have a place. Steal from her or hurt anyone, and she'd personally make sure we went back to prison for twice as long. And did any of you, Margaret wasn't sure how to phrase the question delicately. Steal from her? Betray her? Rowan shook his head. Not one. Not in 6 years. Because she treated us like men instead of criminals, like we had value instead of just being mistakes that walked around on 2 legs. Hard to betray someone who sees you that way. Hard to disappoint someone who believes in you when you don't even believe in yourself. They rode on through the morning, the landscape continuing to change as they climbed in elevation. The air grew cooler, sweeter. Grass appeared in patches where before there had been only dust and stone. Small flowers bloomed in impossible colors, bright orange, vivid purple, sunshine yellow, as though the desert were apologizing for its harshness by offering these small jewels to anyone patient enough to notice them. Around midday, they reached the creek Rowan had mentioned, a clear stream running over smooth stones, bordered by cottonwoods that cast blessed shade. He pulled the wagon under the trees and helped Margaret down, both of them stiff from hours of sitting. We'll rest here a few hours, he said, unhitching the team so they could drink and graze. Heat's worse between noon and 3, and there's no point pushing ourselves or the animals when we don't have to. We're making good time. Probably make it to the Pines by tonight if we want, or camp one more night in the open and arrive at Whispering Pines tomorrow afternoon. What do you recommend? Margaret asked, grateful to be off the wagon seat even as she dreaded climbing back on. Honestly, I'd say we camp tonight and arrive fresh tomorrow. Give you a chance to clean up at a proper stream, get a good night's rest, arrive in town looking like the teacher you are instead of like you've been dragged behind the wagon for 3 days. He grinned slightly. Mrs. Hawkins won't care either way, but some of the town ladies might be watching, and it's easier to start off on the right foot. Margaret appreciated his practicality, his awareness of the social realities she'd face. Thank you. Yes, that sounds wise. They settled into the shade, Margaret removing her boots to dangle her feet in the cold creek water, while Rowan checked the wagon wheels and harness, making small adjustments and repairs. The sound of the water was hypnotic, soothing, and Margaret found her eyes drifting closed despite the brightness of the day. Go ahead and nap if you want, Rowan called from where he was examining one of the wheels. I'll keep watch. Nothing out here that'll bother us in broad daylight. She didn't mean to sleep, but exhaustion pulled her down into dreams that were confused and fragmentary. Thomas's face blending with the conductor's sneer, the train whistle becoming Rowan's voice saying, I've been waiting for you. The letter from Mrs. Hawkins transforming into yellow rose petals that blew away in an endless wind. When she woke, disoriented and slightly embarrassed, the sun had moved significantly across the sky. Rowan was sitting nearby, his back against a cottonwood trunk, reading a book. She blinked in surprise. Somehow, she hadn't expected to find a cowboy reading poetry in the wilderness, but that's what he appeared to be doing. Feeling better? He asked, noticing she was awake. He closed the book carefully, marking his place with a blade of grass. Yes, thank you. I didn't mean to sleep so long. She sat up, pushing hair from her face. What are you reading? He held up the book, almost sheepish. Walt Whitman. Leaves of Grass. My brother Sam gave it to me before he died. Said it was about America becoming itself, finding its voice. I didn't understand it at first, but I keep reading it, and every time I find something new. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. This man was full of surprises. A horse thief who quoted poetry, a cowboy who read Whitman and spoke about his dead brother with quiet reverence. May I? She asked, holding out her hand. He passed her the book, its pages worn soft from repeated reading. She opened it at random and read, I exist as I am, that is enough. If no other in the world be aware, I sit content, and if each and all be aware, I sit content. The words resonated through her like a bell struck in an empty room, to exist as she was, to be content with that existence regardless of who noticed or approved. What would that feel like?
That's the part I keep coming back to, Rowan said quietly, especially after prison. Everyone telling me I was a criminal, that I'd always be a criminal, that I'd never amount to anything but trouble. And then reading that line, I exist as I am, that is enough. And thinking, maybe it is. Maybe I don't have to be ashamed of existing just because I made mistakes. I think, Margaret said slowly, I needed to hear that too. Needed to know that being a widow, being broke, being rejected, none of that means I'm not enough. I still exist. That still has value.
Their eyes met across the space between them, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that they were both people trying to rebuild themselves from ruins, both searching for a way to exist without shame. We should probably eat something, Rowan said finally, breaking the moment. Got some dried beef and hardtack, and I can make more coffee if you want it. They shared the simple meal in comfortable silence, and Margaret realized how rare this was. To be comfortable in another person's presence without the need to fill every moment with conversation. Thomas had been a talker, always sharing his thoughts and ideas, and she'd loved that about him. But there was something peaceful about Rowan's quieter nature, the way he seemed content to simply be without needing to perform or impress. As the afternoon cooled toward evening, they packed up and continued north. The landscape kept changing, becoming greener, more lush. Trees appeared with increasing frequency, first scattered junipers, then dense stands of piñon, and finally, as the sun touched the western horizon, the first ponderosa pines. They were magnificent trees, tall and straight, with reddish bark that glowed in the fading light. Their scent filled the air, sharp and clean, completely different from the dust and creosote smell of the lower desert. Margaret breathed deeply, feeling something in her chest expand and settle at the same time. This is what gives the town its name, Rowan said, gesturing at the forest around them. Whispering pines. When the wind moves through them, it sounds like voices having a conversation just too quiet to make out the words. Some people find it eerie. I've always found it comforting, like the land itself is talking to you, telling you stories if you're patient enough to listen. They made camp that night among the pines, in a small clearing where some previous traveler had built a fire ring from stones. The air was noticeably cooler here, fresh in a way that desert air never quite managed. Rowan built up the fire larger than the previous night, explaining that mountain nights were colder and they'd need the warmth. As twilight deepened into true darkness, they sat by the fire and talked. Rowan asked about her teaching, and Margaret found herself describing the small schoolhouse in St. Louis where she'd worked before marrying Thomas, the children she'd taught to read and write and do sums. The satisfaction of watching understanding dawn in a child's eyes. That's what I miss most, she said, staring into the flames, feeling useful, feeling like I mattered to someone, like my existence made a difference in the world. After Thomas died, I lost that, lost the sense that anyone needed me or cared whether I lived or died. The children in Whispering Pines need you, Rowan said firmly, and they're going to love you, I can already tell. How can you possibly know that? Because you care about them, even though you haven't met them yet. Because you're sitting here 2 days from anywhere, sore and tired and probably scared, and you're still thinking about teaching instead of yourself. That's the kind of teacher kids remember their whole lives. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and sudden. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for saying that. Just the truth. Rowan poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. My brother Sam, he had a teacher like you once. Miss Henderson, her name was. She's the one who taught him to read properly, who gave him books and encouraged him. He used to say she saved his life, that without her, he'd have ended up in a coal mine or dead in a ditch somewhere. Instead, he became someone who read poetry and dreamed about making the world better. She did that. Teachers do that. What happened to him? Margaret asked gently. Your brother. You said he died in a mining accident. Rowan was silent for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he took a deep breath, his voice rough when he finally spoke. Tunnel collapsed. He was working the night shift at a copper mine outside Prescott. They said 30 men went down when the ceiling gave way. They got most of them out, but Sam and 5 others were too deep, buried under too much rock. Took them 3 days to dig down to where they were, and by then, he swallowed hard. By then it was just bodies. They said it was quick, that they probably didn't suffer long. I don't know if that's true, but I tell myself it is. I'm so sorry, Rowan. He was 24 years old, had his whole life ahead of him. We were going to start a ranch together, build something that would last, something that mattered. Then he was gone, and He shook his head. I went a little crazy after that, started drinking too much, running with men who didn't care about tomorrow because they didn't believe in tomorrow. That's how I ended up stealing those horses. Figured if Sam was dead, what did any of it matter? What did laws or decency or any of it matter if good men like him could just disappear into the earth? Margaret understood that kind of rage, that kind of grief-driven recklessness. She'd felt it herself after Thomas died. That sense that the universe was fundamentally unjust and nothing mattered because the person who'd mattered most was gone. But you found your way back, she said. You're here now, living the life he wanted for you, building something that matters. With Mrs. Hawkins's help, yeah. She told me once that the best way to honor the dead is to live well. Not to forget them, but to live so well that they'd be proud to claim you as theirs. He looked at Margaret across the firelight, his pale eyes reflecting the flames. I think your Thomas would want that for you too, would want you to find a place where you can be happy again, where you can matter to people and do work that fulfills you. The words settled into Margaret's heart like seeds planted in good soil. Maybe Rowan was right. Maybe the best way to honor Thomas wasn't to stay frozen in grief, but to live fully enough for both of them. They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their pasts, the good and the bad, the shameful and the proud. Margaret told him about her parents' deaths, about the loneliness of being an orphan at 16, about meeting Thomas at a church social and thinking he was the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered. Rowan told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the war that had taken so many young men and somehow spared him and his brother only to kill Sam later in a mine collapse that had nothing to do with glory or cause. By the time they finally sought their bedrolls, Margaret felt like she knew this man, really knew him, in a way she hadn't known most people she'd called friends back in St. Louis. There was something about traveling together through wilderness, about sharing meals and stories under stars, that stripped away the polite masks people wore in civilized society and revealed what was underneath. What was underneath Rowan Pierce, she'd discovered, was a fundamentally decent man still trying to forgive himself for not always being decent. A man who'd been broken and had chosen to rebuild rather than stay broken. A man who read poetry and spoke tenderly of his dead brother and treated a desperate widow with kindness that expected nothing in return. She fell asleep that night listening to the wind whisper through the pines, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't dream of loss. She dreamed instead of possibility, of a small town nestled in these mountains, of children waiting to learn, of a life that might still have purpose and meaning, even though the life she'd planned was gone forever. Morning came with the smell of pine and coffee, and Margaret woke feeling more rested than she had in months. Her body was adjusting to the wagon's demands, and though she was still sore, it was manageable now rather than agonizing. Last day of travel, Rowan announced cheerfully as he handed her a cup of coffee. We'll reach Whispering Pines by mid-afternoon if we make steady progress. Thought you might want to wash up at the stream before we go. Water's cold but clean, and there's a spot behind those rocks where you'll have complete privacy. Margaret accepted gratefully, gathering her spare dress and her small bar of soap. The stream was indeed cold, shockingly so. But it felt wonderful to wash away 3 days of travel dust, to rebraid her hair properly, to change into clean clothes. When she returned to camp, Rowan had the wagon ready and waiting, though she noticed he'd also washed and changed, his hair still damp and his face freshly shaved. You clean up nice, she said, surprising herself with the teasing tone. He grinned. You too, ma'am. You look like a proper teacher now, instead of a refugee from a dust storm. They set off with the morning sun at their backs, traveling deeper into the pine forest. The road here was better maintained, suggesting they were approaching civilization, and indeed, they began to see signs of human presence. Split-rail fences marking property lines, occasional cabins with smoke rising from their chimneys, clearings where cattle grazed.
We're on Hawkins' land now, Rowan explained. Mrs.
Hawkins owns about 1,500 acres, stretching from here to the town and beyond. Most of it's open range for the cattle, but there's good water and grass, and the pines provide shelter in winter. As they traveled, they passed ranch hands who called out greetings to Rowan. "Hey, Pierce, got the new teacher? That her, Rowan? Mrs. Hawkins gonna be pleased you didn't lose her along the way." Rowan responded to each with easy familiarity, introducing Margaret briefly to men with weathered faces and curious eyes. They all seemed friendly, welcoming even, and Margaret felt some of her anxiety begin to ease. These were working people, people who understood hardship and valued competence over pedigree. Around noon, they stopped at a small ranch house where an older couple invited them in for lunch. Jose and Maria Santangelo, their name was, and they had 3 children who would be Margaret's students, 2 boys and a girl ages 7 to 12. The children hung back shyly at first, but Maria encouraged them forward. "This is Mrs. Hale," she corrected herself, glancing at Margaret's black dress. "She's going to be your teacher. You be respectful and learn well, yes?" The eldest boy, Miguel, stepped forward with his hat in his hands. "Will you teach us English, Mrs. Hale? Papa says we need to speak it better if we want to have opportunities." "I'll teach you English," Margaret promised, charmed by his earnest expression, "and mathematics and history and reading and anything else you want to learn. That's what teachers do." The girl, Rosita, tugged at her mother's skirt. "Will you teach us like Mrs. Hawkins does, with stories?" "Mrs. Hawkins tells you stories?" Maria smiled. "When she teaches them, she makes everything into a story. History is stories about people who lived before. Mathematics is stories about numbers. The children love it, but she doesn't have enough time to teach them properly. We're all very grateful you've come." After a lunch of fresh tortillas, beans, and vegetables from Maria's garden, they continued on. Margaret found herself thinking about those 3 children, about their eagerness to learn, about their parents' hopes for them. This was real, she thought. This wasn't some abstract teaching position in a town that didn't want her. These were actual children who needed education, whose futures might genuinely be shaped by what she could give them. The responsibility of it was humbling and energizing at the same time. "Almost there," Rowan said as they crested a rise. "Whispering Pines, straight ahead." Margaret looked where he pointed, and there it was, a small valley cupped between pine-covered hills, with a silver creek running through its center, and buildings clustered along what appeared to be a main street. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin columns, and she could see the white shape of a church steeple rising above the other structures. Beyond the town, the mountains rose in layers of blue and purple, snow-touched peaks standing guard over this small settlement of humanity. It was beautiful. Unexpectedly, achingly beautiful. "What do you think?" Rowan asked quietly, watching her face. Margaret found she couldn't speak for a moment, emotion closing her throat. What did she think? She thought that 3 days ago she'd been invisible on a train platform, and now she was looking at a place that wanted her, needed her, had sent someone to bring her home. "I think," she finally managed, "it looks like exactly where I'm supposed to be." Rowan's smile was sunrise bright. "Good," he said simply. "Let's get you home." They descended into the valley as the afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold. People emerged from buildings to watch them pass, and Margaret felt their eyes on her, curious, assessing, but not unkind. She sat up straighter, trying to look confident and capable rather than terrified and overwhelmed. Rowan guided the wagon down the main street, pointing out landmarks. "That's the general store. Old Pete runs it. The saloon there. That's Jimmy Two Fingers' place. The church, the smithy, Doc Carter's office, though he's only here once a month. And up ahead, that's the Hawkins ranch house." It was larger than the other buildings, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and windows that caught the afternoon light. As they approached, the front door opened and a woman emerged. She was exactly as Rowan had described, 50-something, gray-haired, weathered by sun and work. But her face was kind, her smile genuine, and her eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, held warmth and welcome as she came down the porch steps. "Mrs. Hale," she said, her voice rich and sure. "Welcome to Whispering Pines. I'm Constance Hawkins, and I cannot tell you how glad I am that you're here." Rowan helped Margaret down from the wagon and she found herself standing face to face with the woman who'd saved her life, though they'd never met until this moment. "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice shaking slightly. "Thank you for everything. The letter, sending Rowan, giving me this chance when I had nowhere else to go." Constance Hawkins reached out and took both of Margaret's hands in her own work-roughened ones. "My dear, you're the one doing us a favor. Those children need you, and this town needs you. Now come inside. You must be exhausted from the journey, and we have so much to discuss. Rowan, have one of the boys take care of the team and bring Mrs. Hale's bag to the house." She guided Margaret toward the porch, talking all the while about the town and the children and the school. Margaret glanced back once to see Rowan watching them, his expression soft with something that might have been relief or satisfaction or perhaps just gladness that he'd completed his mission successfully. He caught her looking and tipped his hat, that slight smile playing at his lips. "See you tomorrow, ma'am," he called. "We'll visit the schoolhouse together, if that suits you." "Yes," Margaret called back, finding herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Yes, I'd like that very much." And as Constance Hawkins led her into the warm, book-filled ranch house, Margaret Hale realized that maybe Rowan had been right. Maybe she had needed to lose everything so she could find where she truly belonged. Maybe the path wasn't supposed to be straight. Maybe sometimes you had to be rejected at the station so a cowboy could ride up and say, "I've been waiting for you," and take you home to a place you'd never heard of but needed more than anything. Maybe this was what beginning again looked like. The inside of Constance Hawkins' house was nothing like Margaret had expected. Where she'd anticipated rustic simplicity, she found warmth and character. Walls lined with bookshelves overflowing with volumes, comfortable furniture that showed use but not neglect, windows dressed with curtains that let in the afternoon light while maintaining privacy. A large fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel crowded with photographs in simple frames, and everywhere Margaret looked, she saw evidence of a life fully lived. "Sit, please," Constance said, guiding her to a chair upholstered in faded blue fabric. "You must be exhausted. 3 days on the road with Rowan? He's wonderful company, but that wagon isn't exactly a luxury conveyance." Margaret sank into the chair gratefully, feeling muscles she hadn't known existed protest the movement. "He was very kind, very thoughtful. He's a good man." Constance moved to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of what looked like lemonade from a sweating pitcher. "I know what you're thinking. How could I trust a convicted horse thief to bring a woman I'd never met safely across the territory? But I've known Rowan Pierce for 6 years now, and I'd trust him with my life, with anyone's life." She handed Margaret a glass, the liquid cold and tart and absolutely perfect after days of creek water and trail coffee. Margaret drank deeply before responding. "He told me about his past, about his brother, about prison, about everything, really. We had a lot of time to talk. And you came anyway." Constance settled into the chair opposite, studying Margaret with those dark, penetrating eyes. "That tells me something about your character, that you can look past a man's mistakes to see what he's become. That's a rare quality, Mrs. Hale." "Please, call me Margaret, and I—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I'm in no position to judge anyone for their past. My own recent history isn't exactly something to be proud of." "Being widowed isn't a failing," Constance said sharply. "Neither is being poor or desperate or rejected by small-minded people who should know better. Don't let Aldrich and his ilk make you feel ashamed for surviving." The fierce protectiveness in her voice startled Margaret. This woman barely knew her, yet she was already defending her, already treating her rejection at Tucson as a personal affront. "How did you even know about what happened?" Margaret asked. "Your letter said your cousin was on the school board, but how did she know to contact you?" Constance smiled, the expression softening her weathered features. "Beatrice has been trying to get me to move back to Tucson for years. Thinks I'm wasting my life out here in the wilderness. When she heard the board had hired a young widow from St. Louis, she wrote me all about it, partly to show me that even small towns need educated women, partly just to gossip. Then, 3 days later, she sent a telegram. Just 3 words. Aldrich destroyed her." She paused, her expression darkening with remembered anger. "I knew what that meant. Conrad Aldrich is a bully and a coward who uses his money to control people. The fact that he'd blocked your hiring because of some twisted moral judgment about widowhood." She shook her head. "I wired Beatrice back immediately and asked where you were. She said you were probably already on your way to Cedar Springs, planning to catch the train to Tucson. So I sent Rowan with instructions to meet every train until you appeared." Margaret felt tears threatening again. "You did all that for a stranger." "I did it because it was right, and because—" Constance leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Because I know what it's like to have the world decide you're not good enough. When my husband died, several of our so-called friends suggested I should sell the ranch and move back east, live with relatives, become someone's poor relation, as though a woman couldn't possibly run a ranch on her own, as though I needed a man to make my life legitimate. But you didn't sell. Hell no, I didn't sell." Constance's smile was fierce. "I hired good people, learned everything I didn't already know, and built this ranch into something profitable and sustainable. And along the way, I discovered that the best people are often the ones society has discarded. Rowan and his fellow ex-convicts work harder and more honestly than half the supposedly respectable men I've known. The Mexican families who stayed after the mines closed are the backbone of this community. The drifters and the outcasts and the second chancers, they're the ones who made Whispering Pines into a real town." She stood, pacing to the window to look out at the valley beyond. "That's what we are here, Margaret. We're the people who didn't fit anywhere else, who got knocked down and decided to get back up somewhere new. And we take care of each other because we understand that life is hard enough without making it harder for folks who are just trying to survive." Margaret absorbed this, feeling something in her chest expand. A sense of belonging, perhaps, or just relief at finding a place where being broken wasn't a disqualification, but rather a prerequisite for membership. "The children," she said. "Tell me about them." Constance's expression transformed, pride and affection chasing away the anger. "Oh, they're wonderful. Challenging, bright, eager. You met the Santangelo children, I assume? Jose and Maria's 3? "Yes, at lunch. Miguel asked if I'd teach them better English. He's sharp as a tack, that boy. And his sister Rosita, she's going to be a writer someday. I'd bet my ranch on it. She tells stories that would make you laugh and cry in the same breath." Constance returned to her chair, settling in with the air of someone about to share treasured information. "Then there's the Morrison clan, 6 children ranging from 5 to 14. The father, Jack Morrison, works my northern range. The mother died in childbirth 3 years ago, and the oldest girl, Sarah, has been raising her siblings ever since. She's 14 years old and more responsible than most adults I know." Margaret's heart ached for this girl, forced into motherhood before she'd had a chance to be a child herself. "I'll make sure she still has time to learn, to be young." "I knew you'd say that." Constance's smile was warm. "The Johnsons have 4 boys, all of them wild as March hares but good-hearted. The father's a blacksmith, and the boys are learning the trade, but they need book learning too. Then we've got the Chen family. They ran a laundry service for the mine and stayed after it closed. 2 children, boy and girl, both quiet and studious. The Bradleys, the Steeles, the Rodriguezes, I could go on. 19 children total, and every single one of them deserves a chance at education. And you've been teaching them? In your barn?" "When I can, which isn't nearly often enough. The ranch demands constant attention, especially during calving season or when we're moving cattle. I do my best, but—" She spread her hands helplessly. "I'm one person with 100 responsibilities. The children need someone dedicated, someone who can give them structure and consistency and proper instruction. They need you, Margaret." The weight of it should have been crushing, but instead Margaret felt energized. Purpose, she realized. This was purpose, tangible and immediate and desperately needed. "When can I start?" Constance's laugh was delighted. "Eager, are you? Good. But first, let's get you settled. Your house is ready, or as ready as we could make it in 3 days. It needs a woman's touch, needs furniture and curtains, and all the things that make a house a home. But it's clean and sound, and it's yours for as long as you want it." She stood, gesturing for Margaret to follow. "Come on, let's get you over there, let you rest tonight, and tomorrow we'll tackle everything else. The schoolhouse, meeting the families, organizing your curriculum, all of it can wait until you've had a proper night's sleep in a real bed." They walked through town as the afternoon faded toward evening, Constance pointing out landmarks and introducing Margaret to the people they passed. Old Pete at the general store, a wizened man with kind eyes who promised to have supplies ready whenever she needed them. Jimmy Two Fingers at the saloon, who played a quick melody on his guitar in greeting, the missing fingers apparently no impediment to his skill. The Reverend Matthews outside the church, a young man with an earnest face who welcomed her to the community and promised the church was available for school use if needed. Everyone was friendly, curious but not intrusive, welcoming without being overwhelming. Margaret felt their interest like a tangible thing, but it didn't feel judgmental or demanding. They were simply glad she was there, glad their children would finally have a proper teacher. The schoolhouse was at the edge of town, and Margaret's heart sank slightly when she saw it. Constance hadn't been exaggerating. It really was a barn. A small barn, true, but still recognizably a structure designed for animals rather than education. The walls were rough wood, the floor packed dirt, and the windows were few and small. "I know it's not ideal," Constance said, watching Margaret's face, "but it's weatherproof, and we've cleared it out completely. The men built some benches and a table for you to use as a desk. We've collected books from everyone in town who had any. It's not much, but it's a start." And she pushed open the door. "We tried to make it welcoming." Margaret stepped inside and felt her throat tighten with emotion. Yes, it was a barn, but someone had swept it clean, whitewashed the walls, and arranged rough wooden benches in neat rows facing a makeshift desk. Shelves had been built along one wall, already stocked with an eclectic collection of books. Wildflowers stood in a jar on the desk, and someone had drawn pictures on pieces of paper and tacked them to the walls. Children's drawings of birds and horses and houses, of families and flowers and dreams. "The children did those," Constance said softly. "When they heard a real teacher was coming, they wanted to decorate for you, wanted you to know they were excited." Margaret walked slowly to the desk, trailing her fingers over its rough surface. It wasn't the proper schoolhouse in Tucson with its painted walls and glass windows and ordered rows of desks. It wasn't grand or impressive or even particularly comfortable, but it was hers, and it was needed. And the children who would fill these benches were real and eager and deserving of everything she could give them. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It's absolutely perfect." Constance's smile was brilliant. "I'm glad you think so. Now come on, your house is just up the road, and you need to get settled before dark." The house was small but charming, a simple structure with 2 rooms as promised, a main living space with a small kitchen area and a stove, and a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and a chest of drawers. The floor was real wood, worn smooth by previous occupants, and the window had actual glass, a luxury in this rough country. The walls had been freshly whitewashed, and someone had left more wildflowers on the table, along with a loaf of fresh bread and a crock of butter. "The bed needs a mattress," Constance said apologetically. "We have ticking and straw ready. I'll send some of the boys over tomorrow to help you make one. And you'll need linens, curtains, cookware, all the domestic necessities. Make a list, and we'll see what we can provide from the ranch stores and what Pete can order from his suppliers." "I have a little money," Margaret said. "Not much, but I can pay for—" "You'll do no such thing." Constance's tone brooked no argument. "Consider it part of your employment package. We're asking you to teach our children for $30 a month, which is less than you deserve. The least we can do is make sure you have what you need to live decently." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist on maintaining her independence, but exhaustion was crashing over her like a wave. 3 days of travel, the emotional upheaval of everything that had happened, the overwhelming newness of this place and these people, it was all catching up with her at once. "Thank you," she said simply, because there were no words adequate to express what she was feeling. Constance squeezed her shoulder gently. "You're welcome, dear. Now, there's a bedroll on the bed frame for tonight. It's not ideal, but it'll do until we get you a proper mattress. I'll have someone bring you dinner in an hour or so. Tomorrow, after you've rested, we'll start getting you properly settled. Does that sound manageable?" "Yes. Thank you. For everything." After Constance left, Margaret stood in the center of her new home, turning slowly to take it all in. It was sparse, nearly empty, but it was hers. A place where she could close the door and be private, where she could build a life according to her own design rather than someone else's expectations. She walked to the window and looked out at whispering pines. at the small cluster of buildings, at the pine-covered hills beyond, at the mountains standing guard in the distance. Somewhere out there, Rowan was probably unsaddling his horse, settling back into his own life after 3 days of playing escort to a desperate widow. Tomorrow, he'd promised to take her to the schoolhouse again, to help her prepare for her first day of teaching. Tomorrow felt very far away and impossibly close at the same time. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a young woman, perhaps 20, with dark hair and a shy smile, holding a covered basket. "Mrs. Hale? I'm Sarah Morrison. Mrs. Hawkins asked me to bring you supper." The 14-year-old who was raising 5 siblings. Except she didn't look 14. She looked older, care and responsibility having aged her prematurely. Margaret smiled warmly, stepping back to let her in. "Sarah, thank you. Please come in. And call me Margaret. We're going to be seeing a lot of each other, and I'd like us to be friends as well as teacher and student." Sarah's face lit up with surprised pleasure as she set the basket on the table. "Really? I'd like that. I brought stew and cornbread, and there's apple pie because Mrs. Hawkins said you'd probably need something sweet after your journey." They sat together at the small table, and Margaret learned that Sarah's mother had died giving birth to the youngest child, Tommy, who was now 3. Sarah had been 11 at the time, suddenly responsible for a newborn, a 5-year-old, and 4 children in between. Her father worked long hours on the ranch, coming home exhausted, and Sarah had learned to cook, clean, mend clothes, and parent her siblings while still being a child herself. "Don't you resent it?" Margaret asked gently, "having to grow up so fast?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Sometimes I see other girls my age, and they're worried about dresses and boys and silly things, and I think about how I can't remember the last time I worried about anything except whether Tommy's cough is serious or if we have enough flour to last until Papa's next payday. But then," she paused, her expression softening. "Then I look at my brothers and sisters, and I see how they're growing, how they're healthy and happy, and I think maybe it's worth it. Maybe being needed is better than being carefree." Margaret's heart ached for this girl who'd had to become wise too soon. "You're doing an amazing job, Sarah, but you deserve to have dreams too. What do you want, if you could have anything?" Sarah's eyes went distant, as though she were looking at something only she could see. "I want to be a nurse. I want to learn proper medicine so I can help people, so that maybe next time someone gets sick or hurt, they don't have to die just because we're too far from a real doctor. But that takes training, and training costs money we don't have." "Then we'll start working toward it," Margaret said firmly. "I'll teach you everything I know about science and anatomy, and we'll write to nursing schools to find out what you need to know. It might take time, but if it's what you want, we'll find a way." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You mean that? You'd help me?" "Of course I would. That's what teachers do. They help students reach for dreams that seem impossible and make them possible instead." After Sarah left, taking the empty basket and a promise to return the next day with her siblings, Margaret ate the stew mechanically, her mind full of this new life she was building. 19 children, each with their own stories, their own struggles, their own dreams. It was overwhelming and thrilling and terrifying all at once. She spread the bedroll on the bed frame and lay down as darkness fell completely, turning whispering pines into a collection of lit windows scattered through the pines. Somewhere, families were settling in for the evening, children being tucked into bed, adults discussing the day's events, the ordinary rhythms of domestic life continuing as they had for generations. And she was part of it now. Part of this community, this place, this collection of people who'd decided she was worth saving even though they'd never met her. Sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless, her body finally allowing itself to rest now that the journey was complete. She woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of voices outside. Disoriented, she stumbled to the door and opened it to find 4 young men unloading materials from a wagon, ticking fabric, fresh straw, wooden slats, and various other supplies. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," one of them called cheerfully. "We're here to make your mattress and get you fixed up proper. Mrs. Hawkins sent us, along with—" He gestured, and Margaret saw more wagons arriving, driven by women carrying baskets and bundles. Within an hour, her small house had been transformed into organized chaos. The men built her mattress, stuffing the ticking with clean straw and sewing it shut with surprising competence. The women unpacked linens and curtains, cooking pots and dishes, soap and candles, and all the domestic necessities Margaret had lacked. They measured windows for proper curtains, discussed the best arrangement of furniture, and debated the merits of various housekeeping strategies with the seriousness of generals planning a campaign. Margaret tried to help, but mostly she stood back and watched in amazement as these people, strangers until yesterday, transformed her empty house into a home. They worked with cheerful efficiency, teasing each other and telling stories, including her in the conversation as though she'd always been part of their community. Around mid-morning, Rowan appeared at the door, hat in hand, his expression amused as he surveyed the domestic whirlwind inside. "Looks like Mrs. Hawkins mobilized the troops," he said. "How are you holding up?" "I'm overwhelmed," Margaret admitted. "Everyone's being so kind, so generous. I don't know how to thank them." "Just teach their children well. That's all the thanks they want." He glanced around at the busy women. "I was supposed to take you to the schoolhouse this morning, but it looks like you might be occupied here for a while yet." "Give me 10 minutes to make myself presentable," Margaret said. "I could use some air and I want to start planning my curriculum." She changed quickly into her better dress, pinned her hair up properly, and joined Rowan outside. The morning air was cool and pine-scented, and as they walked toward the schoolhouse, Margaret found herself relaxing into his quiet presence. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I have in months. Your Mrs. Hawkins sent Sarah Morrison with dinner. She's remarkable, that girl." "She is. Practically raised those kids single-handed after her mama died. Her pa's a good man, but he's drowning in grief and work, barely staying afloat. Sarah's the one holding that family together." They reached the schoolhouse, and Rowan held the door open for her. In the morning light, the space looked both better and worse than it had the previous evening. Better because the whitewashed walls seemed brighter, the children's drawings more cheerful. Worse because the reality of teaching in a converted barn became more apparent. The uneven floor, the crude benches, the lack of proper supplies. "It ain't fancy," Rowan said, watching her face. "But I thought maybe we could make it better. I'm handy with tools, and if you tell me what you need, I can probably build it. Desks instead of benches, maybe. A proper bookshelf. A raised platform where you can stand so all the kids can see you." Margaret walked to the front of the room, imagining it filled with children, their faces turned toward her, eager and expectant. "Could you build individual desks with space for them to keep their slates and books?" "Sure. Take me a few weeks working evenings, but I could do it." "And maybe a real chalkboard? I know slate is expensive, but even a board painted with slate paint would work." "I'll talk to Pete about what he can order." Rowan moved around the room, assessing. "We could put up better shelves here, maybe some hooks along this wall for coats and lunch pails. And we should probably build a small shed outside for storing firewood. You'll need that stove going most of the winter." Margaret turned to look at him. This man who kept appearing exactly when she needed help, who offered assistance without being asked, who seemed to genuinely care about making her life easier. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You've already done so much, bringing me here, being kind, and now offering to build furniture in your spare time. Why?" Rowan was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes meeting hers steadily. "Couple reasons, I guess. First, because Mrs. Hawkins asked me to look after you, and I don't take her requests lightly. Second, because these kids deserve a good school, and you deserve the tools to give them one. And third," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "because I know what it's like to need help and not get it, to be drowning and have people just watch you go under. I don't ever want to be the person who sees someone struggling and just walks by." The honesty of it, the simple decency, made Margaret's chest tight. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me instead of looking away." "Easy to see you, Margaret. You're kind of hard to miss." The comment startled a laugh from her, and the tension broke. They spent the next hour planning improvements to the schoolhouse, Rowan taking notes on a scrap of paper, sketching rough designs for desks and shelves. He had a practical mind and skilled hands, and Margaret found herself enjoying the collaboration, the sense of building something together. "When do you plan to start teaching?" he asked as they prepared to leave. "Monday, I think. That gives me a few more days to settle in, to prepare lessons, to meet more of the families. Mrs. Hawkins is hosting a gathering Sunday afternoon.
She said all the parents will come so they can meet me officially. Nervous? Terrified, Margaret admitted. What if I'm not good enough? What if they expect someone better educated, more experienced? I taught for 3 years in St.
Louis, but that was before I got married, and it was younger children. And Margaret, Rowan's voice was gentle but firm. You're exactly what they need. Not some fancy college-educated teacher who'd look down on ranchers and miners. Someone who understands hard work and hardship, who knows what it means to lose everything and have to start over. Someone who will see these kids as individuals with potential instead of just another class to get through. How do you know that's who I am? Because I've spent 3 days watching you, watching how you treat people, how you listen, how you care. That little girl Rosita at the Sant'Angelo place. You noticed her shyness and made a point to speak directly to her, to make her feel seen. And Sarah last night, you didn't just accept her help, you asked about her dreams. That's the kind of teacher these kids need. Margaret felt tears threatening again. When had she become such an easy crier? You make me sound much better than I am. I'm just telling you what I see. He opened the door, gesturing for her to precede him. Come on, let's get you back to your house. You've got a lot to do before Sunday, and I should get back to the ranch before Mrs. Hawkins decides I'm shirking my duties. They walked back through town, greeting the people they passed, and Margaret marveled at how quickly this place was becoming familiar. Just 2 days, and already she could name the buildings, recognize faces, feel the beginnings of belonging taking root in her chest. At her house, the chaos had settled into order. Her bed was made with crisp white sheets, curtains hung at the windows, dishes filled the shelves, and the whole space smelled of fresh bread and pine soap. The women were just finishing, and they gathered around to show her what they'd done, pointing out storage spaces and explaining the quirks of the wood stove. Thank you, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. All of you. It's more than I ever expected. You've made this place a home. Maria Sant'Angelo stepped forward and took Margaret's hands. You came when we needed you, she said simply. This is just us saying we're glad you're here. After everyone left, Margaret stood in the center of her home and felt something she hadn't felt since before Thomas got sick. Happiness. Not the absence of sadness, but actual happiness. The kind that came from being exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Margaret met more families, learned more children's names, started planning her curriculum and organizing her limited supplies. She spent hours in the schoolhouse, arranging and rearranging, trying to create a space that would feel welcoming and conducive to learning despite its humble origins. Rowan appeared each evening after his ranch work was done, bringing wood he'd cut to size for desks, tools borrowed from the smithy, and his steady presence that somehow made every task seem more manageable. They worked side by side as twilight faded into darkness, him building and her organizing, talking easily about everything and nothing. Sunday arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine, perfect weather for the gathering at the Hawkins Ranch. Margaret dressed carefully in her best dress, still black because her mourning period wasn't technically over, but she'd added a white collar that made it seem less funereal. She braided her hair and pinned it up, studying her reflection in the small mirror someone had donated to her house. She looked nervous, she thought, but also hopeful, also ready. The Hawkins Ranch was transformed when she arrived. Tables set up on the lawn, food covering every surface, children running wild in the sunshine while parents gathered in clusters, talking and laughing. Margaret felt a moment of panic, all these people, all these expectations. But then Constance was at her side, introducing her, easing her into conversations, making sure she never felt alone or overwhelmed. The families welcomed her warmly, asking about her plans for the school, offering their own children's strengths and challenges. The Morrison father, Jack, shook her hand with tears in his eyes and thanked her for being kind to Sarah. The Chen family brought her a beautiful drawing their daughter had made, depicting a schoolhouse surrounded by happy children. The Johnson boys presented her with a carved wooden apple, their father explaining sheepishly that they'd wanted to give the teacher an apple like in stories, but it was the wrong season, so they'd made one instead. Margaret felt herself falling in love with these people, with their genuine warmth and their determination to give their children better futures. This was what teaching was supposed to be, not just imparting knowledge, but
but becoming part of a community, invested in its children's success because their success was everyone's success. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself sitting with a group of women discussing everything from curriculum to cooking to the challenges of frontier life. They included her naturally in their conversations, asking her opinions, sharing their own experiences, treating her like she'd always been one of them. Across the lawn, she saw Rowan playing with some of the younger children, letting them climb on him like he was a human jungle gym, his laughter carrying across the distance. He caught her watching and smiled, that warm, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face, and Margaret felt something shift in her chest, something she quickly pushed away because it was too soon, too complicated, too much to examine when she was still figuring out how to be a widow who was learning to live again. As the sun began to set and families started preparing to leave, Constance found Margaret and drew her aside. "Well," she asked, "what do you think? Can you be happy here?" Margaret looked around at the people who'd become her community in less than a week, at the children who would be her students, at the mountains standing guard over this small valley where people who didn't fit anywhere else had found a place to belong. "Yes," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. "Yes, I think I can be very happy here indeed." Monday morning arrived with a crispness in the air that spoke of autumn's approach, and Margaret woke before dawn with her stomach in knots. Her first day as the teacher of Whispering Pines. She dressed carefully, braided her hair with trembling fingers, and stood in her small kitchen trying to force down breakfast she couldn't taste. Through her window, she could see the schoolhouse in the distance, waiting. All those children, all those expectations, all those dreams resting on her ability to be enough. She was halfway to the door when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Through the window, she saw Rowan dismounting, and despite her nervousness, she felt a small smile tug at her lips. Of course he was here. He always seemed to be here when she needed someone. "Morning," he called as she stepped outside. "Figured you might appreciate some company walking to your first day. Is it that obvious I'm terrified? You look calm as anything to me, but I remember my first day working for Mrs. Hawkins, how my hands wouldn't stop shaking, how I was sure I'd mess everything up and prove everyone right about convicts being worthless." He fell into step beside her, his horse trailing behind. Turned out the anticipation was worse than the reality. Once you start doing the thing you're scared of, the fear gets smaller. They walked through town as it was waking up, smoke beginning to rise from chimneys, doors opening as people started their day. Several folks called out good luck wishes to Margaret, and she waved back, grateful for the support even as it amplified the pressure she felt. At the schoolhouse, Rowan tied his horse to a post and followed her inside. The space looked better than it had even a few days ago. He'd finished 3 of the small desks he'd been building, and they sat in the front row like promises of things to come. The chalkboard he'd painted on one wall was still drying, but it would be ready by tomorrow. Fresh firewood was stacked neatly by the stove, ready for when the mornings grew cold enough to need it. "You've done so much," Margaret said, running her hand over one of the desks. "These are beautiful, Rowan, better than what we had at my school in St. Louis. They're just wood and nails, nothing special. They're special because you made them with care, because you were thinking about the children who'd use them, wanting them to have something good." She looked up at him. "That matters. It means something." He shifted uncomfortably the way he always did when she thanked him, as though gratitude was something he didn't know how to receive. "I should let you get ready. The kids will start arriving soon, and you probably need—" "Rowan." She touched his arm lightly, stopping him. "Thank you for everything. For being here this morning when I was too nervous to breathe properly. For making furniture in your spare time, for believing I can do this." His pale eyes held hers, and something passed between them, something warm and complicated that Margaret wasn't ready to name. "You can do this, Margaret. I know you can, and I'll be back after school to hear how it went, if that's all right with you." "I'd like that." He left, swinging back into his saddle with that easy grace, and Margaret watched him ride away before turning to face the empty schoolhouse. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and began preparing for her students. She wrote the date on the chalkboard in careful letters, September 15th, 1878, and below it, "Welcome." She arranged books on the shelves, set out the few slates and pieces of chalk she had,
and placed the carved wooden apple the Johnson boys had given her prominently on her desk, where she could see it whenever doubt crept in. Then she heard them, the sound of children's voices, high and excited, getting closer. Her heart hammered as the door burst open and they flooded in. 19 children ranging from tiny Tommy Morrison, barely 3 and clutching his sister Sarah's hand, to Miguel Santangelo at 12, trying to look grown up and failing to hide his eagerness. They stopped when they saw her, suddenly shy, these children who'd been running and shouting a moment before. Margaret smiled, trying to project a confidence she didn't quite feel. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Mrs. Hale, and I'm so very happy to meet all of you. I've heard wonderful things about how eager you are to learn, and I promise to do my very best to be the teacher you deserve. Now, why don't we all sit down? The 3 desks in front are finished, so our oldest students can use those, and everyone else on the benches. And we'll start by learning each other's names properly." The ice broke slowly at first, then faster, as the children realized she was kind, that she listened when they spoke, that she was genuinely interested in their lives. She learned that 10-year-old James Johnson wanted to be a blacksmith like his father, but also loved stories about knights and dragons. That 8-year-old Rosita Santangelo wrote poems in Spanish and English and was afraid they weren't good enough. That the Chen children, Lee and May, spoke perfect English, but their parents worried it wasn't proper enough. That Sarah Morrison's youngest brother Tommy insisted on staying even though he was far too young for school because he didn't want to be separated from his sister. Margaret spent the morning assessing their abilities, discovering that they ranged from children who could barely write their names to others who read at levels beyond their years. She would need to teach multiple grades simultaneously, which was challenging but not impossible. She'd done it before in St. Louis, though never with such a wide range of ages and abilities. By lunchtime, when the children scattered outside to eat the food they'd brought in pails and baskets, Margaret felt exhausted but exhilarated. This was why she'd become a teacher. This moment when knowledge sparked in a child's eyes, when understanding dawned and you could see them making connections, growing, becoming more than they'd been an hour before. She was eating her own simple lunch at her desk when Sarah Morrison appeared in the doorway, looking hesitant. "Mrs. Hale, may I speak with you?" "Of course, Sarah, come in." Margaret gestured to one of the new desks. "Is everything all right?" Sarah sat carefully, her worn dress smoothing beneath her work-roughened hands. "I wanted to thank you for letting Tommy stay. Most teachers would have sent him home, said he was too young, but he needs—" Her voice caught slightly. "He needs me. Since Mama died, he gets scared when I'm not near. And I know it's not right that he should be braver, but Sarah," Margaret's voice was gentle but firm, "you don't need to apologize for loving your brother or for him needing you. We'll make it work. He can sit with you, play quietly with some blocks I'll ask Mr. Pierce to make, and maybe learn his letters a bit early. Sometimes rules need to bend around human needs." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "You meant what you said about helping me become a nurse." "I absolutely meant it. In fact, I was thinking, you're one of my strongest students, and you're clearly capable of more advanced work. What if I gave you extra assignments in the afternoons after the younger children are dismissed? Science, anatomy, mathematics, everything you'll need to know if you pursue nursing." Sarah's expression transformed, hope lighting her features like sunrise. "Really? You do that?" "It would be my privilege. You're remarkable, Sarah Morrison. You've held your family together through unimaginable hardship, raised 5 children while barely more than a child yourself, and you still have dreams. That's not just remarkable, it's extraordinary. I want to help you reach for those dreams." After Sarah left, wiping tears and smiling for what looked like the first time in years, Margaret stood at the schoolhouse door and watched her students play. They were roughhousing and laughing, their joy uncomplicated, and she felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest. These children, these beautiful, hopeful, deserving children, she would give them everything she had, every bit of knowledge and encouragement and belief she possessed. The afternoon session went smoothly, though by the end of the day Margaret's voice was hoarse from talking and her back ached from bending over students helping them with their work. But as the children filed out, calling goodbyes and thank yous and promises to do their homework, she felt a satisfaction deeper than any she'd known in months. She was cleaning the chalkboard when Rowan appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, his expression curious and slightly anxious. "Well,
he asked. How was it? Margaret turned to him, and to her surprise, tears spilled down her cheeks. Rowan's face went through a series of rapid changes, alarm, concern, the beginning of panic, before she laughed and shook her head. They're wonderful, she said, her voice breaking. Rowan, they're so wonderful, smart and eager and funny and kind. And they need so much. They need books and proper supplies and individual attention, but they're so grateful for whatever I can give them. I feel like I've been given a gift, being allowed to teach these children. Relief flooded his features. You scared me for a minute there. Thought maybe something had gone wrong. No, nothing wrong.
Everything right? Maybe for the first time in a very long time. She wiped her eyes, embarrassed by her emotional display. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm crying. Sometimes happy feels the same as sad when you're not used to feeling it. Rowan stepped into the schoolhouse, looking around at the evidence of the day's lessons. Chalk dust on the floor, slates stacked on her desk, a child's drawing left behind showing what appeared to be Mrs. Hale surrounded by smiling students. They liked you, I can tell. The kids were practically bouncing walking home, talking about what they learned. You saw them? Rode past as they were leaving. Rosita Santangelo ran up and told me you said her poems were beautiful, said she'd never had anyone call her writing beautiful before, and she was going to write one about you. He smiled slightly. You've got a fan for life there. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. She's talented, really talented. I told her I want her to write in both Spanish and English, that being bilingual is a gift, not something to hide. Her mother seemed worried about that, about whether I'd allow Spanish in school. Most teachers around here forbid it, say the kids need to speak proper English if they want to succeed in America. Well, I'm not most teachers. These children should be proud of their heritage, their languages, their cultures. Learning English doesn't mean forgetting where they came from. Margaret began gathering books, organizing for tomorrow's lessons. I want them to see their differences as strengths, not weaknesses. Rowan watched her move around the schoolhouse with a soft expression she couldn't quite read. Mrs. Hawkins was right about you. What do you mean? She said you were exactly what this town needed. Someone who saw people as they were and decided that was enough, that they didn't need to change to deserve kindness or opportunity. He paused, then added quietly, like she did with me, like you're doing with these kids. Margaret stopped organizing and looked at him fully. You keep talking about what Mrs. Hawkins gave you, about second chances and redemption, but Rowan, you earned all of that. She might have opened the door, but you're the one who walked through it and kept walking in the right direction. That takes strength and character. You should be proud of who you've become. Something flickered across his face. Gratitude, perhaps. Or maybe just the painful hope of someone beginning to believe they might actually deserve good things. Walking you home? He asked, deflecting as he always did when conversations turned to his worth. I'd like that. They walked through town in the golden light of late afternoon, and Margaret marveled at how quickly this place had become familiar, how easily she moved through it now. Just a week ago, she'd been a stranger. Now people called her name, asked how her first day went, told her their children had come home full of excitement about school. The whole town's talking about you, Rowan said, amusement in his voice. You made quite an impression. Old Pete said the Johnson boys came into the store and announced you were the smartest lady they'd ever met. And Maria Santangelo told Mrs. Hawkins you were an answer to prayer. That feels like too much pressure, Margaret admitted. What if I can't live up to their expectations? You're already exceeding them just by being here, by caring. That's more than they had before. He glanced at her. You hungry? I know you probably didn't eat much at lunch. Teachers never do. Too busy helping students. I could bring something by from the saloon. Jimmy makes a decent stew, and his biscuits are almost as good as Mrs. Hawkins. Margaret realized she was starving, that in her nervousness this morning she'd barely eaten breakfast and had only picked at lunch. That sounds wonderful, actually, thank you. Give me half an hour. I'll feed my horse and clean up a bit. I've been working cattle all afternoon and probably smell like it. He left her at her door, and Margaret went inside, sinking into one of the chairs with a grateful sigh. Her small house welcomed her like an embrace. The neat space she'd created, the curtains she'd hung, the books stacked on the small table she used as a desk. This was home now, she realized. Not the house in St. Louis with its yellow roses and its memories of Thomas. This small, simple structure in a town she'd never heard of 3 weeks ago. She'd just changed out of her teaching dress into something more comfortable when Rowan knocked. He'd clearly washed quickly. His hair was still damp, and he'd changed into a clean shirt. He carried a covered basket that smelled absolutely heavenly. "Jimmy sent enough for two," he said. "Hope you don't mind if I join you. Seems a shame to eat alone when we've both had long days." They sat at her small table, and Margaret couldn't remember food ever tasting better. As they ate, she told him about her students in detail, their personalities, their abilities, their dreams. He listened with genuine interest, asking questions, making observations that showed he knew many of these children well. "Sarah Morrison came to thank me for letting Tommy stay," Margaret said, soaking up stew with a piece of Jimmy's biscuit. She was so grateful, Rowan, as though allowing a 3-year-old to stay with his sister was some enormous kindness instead of basic human decency. That's because most people don't show her basic human decency. They see a girl raising her siblings and think it's her duty, that she should just accept it without complaint. Nobody asks what she wants, what she dreams about. You did. That matters more than you know. I'm going to help her become a nurse. She's brilliant, Rowan, absolutely brilliant. She could do it if someone just gave her the chance. He smiled at her enthusiasm. And you're going to be that someone. I'm going to try. Margaret paused, then asked, "What about you? What were your dreams before everything happened with your brother?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment, his fork stilling. "Sam and I used to talk about having our own ranch. Nothing huge, just a small spread where we could raise good horses, live honest. He was better with animals than anyone I ever met, could gentle a wild Mustang just by talking to it, seemed to understand what they needed before they knew themselves." His voice went soft with memory. "After he died, I couldn't imagine doing it without him. Seemed wrong, somehow. Like I'd be stealing his dream. Or honoring it," Margaret said gently. "Living the dream you shared, making it real even though he can't be there to see it. That wouldn't be stealing, Rowan. That would be remembering." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Margaret saw something raw and hopeful in his eyes. "You think Mrs. Hawkins would sell me some land? Nothing much, just a few acres I could build on, start small." "I think you should ask her. The worst she can say is no. The worst she can say is she doesn't trust me with that much responsibility, that I'm not ready, that—" He stopped himself, shook his head. "Sorry. Old fears talking. You're right, I should ask." They finished eating as darkness fell completely, talking about everything and nothing. His work on the ranch, her plans for the school, the changes coming to the territory as more people moved west. It was comfortable, easy, like they'd been having these conversations for years instead of barely a week. When Rowan finally stood to leave, gathering the empty basket, Margaret walked him to the door. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead, and for a moment they just stood there, neither quite willing to end the evening. "Thank you for dinner," Margaret said, "and for being here this morning, for checking on me tonight, for everything, really." "It's easy to be here for you, Margaret. You make it easy." He settled his hat on his head, his face shadowed but his voice warm. "Sleep well. Tomorrow's another day with those wonderful students of yours." She watched him ride away, his form gradually disappearing into the darkness, and felt something shift inside her, something she'd thought died with Thomas, but was apparently only sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt like music, challenging but beautiful, exhausting but fulfilling. Margaret taught from dawn until afternoon, poured herself into lesson planning in the evenings, and spent Sundays with various families, learning about her students' lives outside school. The children blossomed under her attention, their reading improving, their confidence growing, their curiosity expanding beyond the boundaries of their small town. Rowan appeared regularly, always with some excuse, bringing more firewood, delivering messages from Mrs. Hawkins, showing her a book he thought she might like. But really, they both knew, he came because they enjoyed each other's company, because their conversations filled something empty in both of them, because slowly, carefully, they were becoming essential to each other's lives. It was October when Mrs. Hawkins invited Margaret to dinner at the ranch house, a small gathering that included just Margaret, Rowan, and Constance herself. They ate at the big dining table, and the conversation flowed easily between the three of them. Talk of the school's progress, the ranch's preparations for winter, the territorial politics that might affect them all. After dinner, as they sat by the fire with coffee, Constance studied them both with those knowing dark eyes. "I have a proposition," she said. "Rowan, you've been working for me for 6 years. You're the best ranch hand I've ever employed, and more than that, you're someone I trust completely. I'd like to sell you 100 acres on the eastern edge of my property. Good land with water access and timber for building. Enough to start that horse ranch you and Sam used to dream about." Rowan's cup clattered against its saucer, coffee nearly sloshing over the rim. "Mrs. Hawkins, I can't afford—" "You can work it off. 20 years at reduced wages, or 15 if you want to pay a bit more. I'll draw up papers making it all legal and proper. The land's yours, Rowan. You've earned it." She smiled. "Besides, I'm not getting any younger. I'd like to know that when I'm gone, this valley will be cared for by people who love it. You're one of those people." Margaret watched Rowan's face cycle through disbelief, hope, and something that looked like the beginning of tears. "I don't know what to say except thank you. Thank you for believing in me when nobody else did. Thank you for giving me a life worth living. You gave yourself that life by choosing to live it well. I just opened a door." Constance turned to Margaret. "And you, my dear, how are you settling in, truly?" "Better than I ever imagined possible," Margaret said honestly. "The children are wonderful. The town has welcomed me completely, and I feel—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I feel useful again, like I matter, like my life has purpose." "Good. You deserve that." Constance's eyes moved between Margaret and Rowan, and a small smile played at her lips. "You both deserve happiness, and I think—" She stopped, shook her head. "Never mind. Some things need to develop in their own time without old women interfering." Walking home that night, Rowan beside her as always, Margaret thought about Constance's words. Some things developing in their own time. Was something developing between her and Rowan? She couldn't deny the way her heart lifted when she saw him, the way his smile had become the best part of her day, the way she found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering what he was doing, whether he was safe, if he'd stopped by that evening. But Thomas had only been dead 8 months. Was it too soon to feel these things? Was she betraying his memory by finding herself drawn to another man? "You're quiet," Rowan observed. "Everything all right?" "Just thinking about how strange life is. How 3 months ago I was standing on a train platform thinking my life was over, and now—" She gestured at the town around them, at the mountains beyond, at everything that had become precious to her. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Fate works in mysterious ways, my mama used to say. She believed everything happened for a reason, even the hard things, especially the hard things. He was quiet a moment, then added, "I'm glad you missed that train, Margaret. I know that's a selfish thing to say, but I'm glad." "I'm glad too," she whispered, and meant it with her whole heart. November brought the first serious snow, transforming Whispering Pines into something from a Christmas card. The schoolhouse required the stove burning constantly, and Margaret's students arrived bundled in layers, their cheeks red from cold, their breath steaming in the morning air. Teaching continued, though winter made everything more challenging. Shorter days, harder travel, the constant battle against cold that seeped through walls and windows. But there was beauty, too. The way snow transformed the pines into frosted sculptures, the way the children's laughter echoed in the crystal-clear air, the way the whole town seemed to draw closer together, sharing resources and helping each other through the hardest season. Margaret's students continued to thrive. Sarah Morrison was working through medical texts Margaret had ordered from back east, her quick mind absorbing information like a sponge. Miguel Santangelo had discovered a love of mathematics and was solving problems meant for students twice his age. Little Rosita filled notebooks with poems that made Margaret's throat tight with their beauty and insight. And through it all, Rowan was there, building the rest of the desks, helping her carry water when the creek froze, making sure her firewood was stacked high and her house was warm. Their friendship had deepened into something neither quite acknowledged but both felt, a connection that went beyond mere companionship into territory that was both thrilling and terrifying. It was December when things shifted irrevocably. Margaret was walking home from school in the early twilight when she slipped on hidden ice, her feet going out from under her, her body heading hard toward the frozen ground. She had time to think this will hurt before strong arms caught her, steadied her, held her until she found her balance. Rowan. Of course it was Rowan. He'd been coming to meet her, she realized, as he'd taken to doing whenever the weather was bad. And now he was holding her, his arms steady around her waist, her hands clutching his shoulders, their faces inches apart in the fading light. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yes. Thank you. But she couldn't finish the sentence because she was suddenly, overwhelmingly aware of him, of how strong he was, how warm, how his pale eyes were looking at her like she was something precious, of how much she wanted him to keep holding her, to never let go. "Margaret," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. "I need to tell you something. I know it's too soon. I know you're still mourning. I know I got no right, but Rowan, I'm falling in love with you." The words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them back too long and they'd finally broken free. "I tried not to. Tried to just be your friend, to keep things proper and respectful. But every day I'm around you, it gets harder to pretend that's all I feel. You're smart and kind and brave. And when you smile at me, I feel like maybe I'm worth something after all. Like maybe I could be the kind of man who deserves someone like you." Margaret stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She should step back, should remind him about propriety, about mourning periods, about how it was too fast, too soon, should protect them both from the complications of this. Instead, she heard herself say, "I'm falling in love with you too. And it terrifies me because I don't know if I'm ready, if it's right, if Thomas would—" Her voice broke. "But I can't seem to stop feeling it, can't stop wanting to see you, to talk to you, to—" "To what?" His voice was barely a whisper. "To be held by you. Like this. Like I matter. Like I'm not alone anymore." They stood there on the frozen path, holding each other as snow began to fall again, soft flakes catching in Margaret's hair and on Rowan's shoulders. Neither moved to break the embrace, both savoring this moment of acknowledged truth, of feelings finally spoken aloud. "What do we do now?" Margaret finally whispered. "Take it slow," Rowan said. "Let it develop in its own time, like Mrs. Hawkins said. No rushing, no pressure. Just letting ourselves feel what we feel and seeing where it leads. If that's all right with you." "That's all right with me," Margaret said, and felt like she was stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. But Rowan's arms were steady around her, and somehow that made falling feel less like danger and more like flight. They walked the rest of the way to her house in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than before, charged with awareness, heavy with possibility, warm despite the cold wind that whipped snow around them. At her door, Rowan released her reluctantly, his hands lingering on her arms for just a moment before he stepped back to a proper distance. "I should go," he said, though his eyes said he wanted to stay. "Let you get warm. Get some rest. Tomorrow's Friday. You'll have your students all day." "Will you come by after?" Margaret asked, surprised by her own boldness. "We could have dinner, talk more about everything." His smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." After he left, Margaret stood in her small house and pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks, trying to process what had just happened. She was falling in love, again, already. Thomas had been gone less than a year, and here she was, her heart opening to another man, feeling things she'd thought she'd never feel again. The guilt came then, sharp and acidic. How could she move on so quickly? How could Thomas's memory mean so little that she'd already replaced him? What kind of wife, what kind of person, fell in love with someone new while still wearing widow's black? She sank into a chair and let the tears come, crying for Thomas, for the life they'd lost, for the future that would never be. But underneath the grief, something else stirred, something that felt like permission, like Thomas's gentle voice saying what he'd said so many times during his illness. "I want you to be happy, Margaret. Promise me you'll let yourself be happy." She'd promised. Standing by his deathbed, holding his wasted hand, she'd promised she would try to find joy again, that she wouldn't spend the rest of her life frozen in mourning. At the time, she'd thought it an impossible promise. Now, months later, and hundreds of miles from where Thomas had died, she wondered if maybe he'd known something she hadn't, that healing required permission, and love required courage, and moving forward didn't mean forgetting. Sleep came eventually, and with it dreams. Not the nightmares of Thomas's death that had plagued her for months, but something gentler. Thomas standing in a field of yellow roses, smiling at her, waving goodbye. And beyond him, just visible through the flowers, another figure waiting. A cowboy with pale blue eyes and patient hands, standing in a valley of whispering pines. Friday's school day passed in a blur of distraction. Margaret tried to focus on her students, on multiplication tables and reading comprehension, but her mind kept drifting to Rowan, to his confession, to her own admission of feelings she'd been trying to ignore. The children seemed to sense her preoccupation, and Sarah Morrison finally asked if she was feeling well. "I'm fine," Margaret assured her, then smiled more genuinely. "Actually, I'm better than fine. Just thinking about the future, about possibilities, nothing to worry about." Sarah studied her with eyes too old for her 14 years. "You look happy, Mrs. Hale." "Really happy. It's nice to see." When school dismissed and the children scattered homeward through the snow, Margaret tidied the schoolhouse with unusual care, her stomach fluttering with anticipation and nervousness in equal measure. She was almost finished when the door opened and Constance Hawkins stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Constance said, her dark eyes taking in Margaret's flushed face and bright eyes. "I wanted to talk to you about something, and it couldn't wait." "Of course, please sit." Margaret gestured to one of Rowan's handmade desks, suddenly worried. Had someone complained about her teaching? Had she done something wrong? But Constance's expression was warm, almost amused. "Relax, dear. You're not in trouble. Quite the opposite, actually. I wanted to talk to you about Rowan." Margaret's heart stuttered. "Oh, did he say something?" "He didn't have to. I've known that boy for 6 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Like you hung the moon and painted the stars." Constance settled onto the desk, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "And you look at him the same way, though you're both trying very hard to be proper about it." "Mrs. Hawkins, I know how it must seem. I'm still in mourning, and it's too soon, and people will talk—" "Let them talk," Constance interrupted firmly. "Margaret, I'm going to tell you something I wish someone had told me after my husband died. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. It doesn't care about propriety or what society thinks is appropriate. Some people mourn for decades. Some people are ready to love again within months. Neither is wrong. Neither is a betrayal." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Your husband, Thomas, wasn't it? Would he want you to be miserable for the rest of your life? Would he want you to deny yourself happiness because of some arbitrary mourning period invented by people who probably never loved anyone as much as you loved him?" "No," Margaret whispered. "He made me promise to be happy, to live fully even after he was gone." "Then honor that promise. Rowan Pierce is a good man who's walked through fire to become someone worthy of respect. He loves you. I can see it in every gesture, every word. And you love him, whether you're ready to admit it or not. Life is too short and too hard to waste time being proper when you could be happy instead." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "I'm scared. What if I'm using him to fill the empty space Thomas left? What if I can't love him the way he deserves because part of my heart is still buried with my husband?" "Hearts don't work that way," Constance said gently. "They don't have limited capacity. Loving Rowan doesn't mean loving Thomas less. It just means you're brave enough to love again, knowing how much it hurts to lose someone. That takes more courage than staying safe and alone." After Constance left, Margaret sat in the empty schoolhouse and thought about courage. She'd never considered herself particularly brave. She'd married Thomas because she loved him, taught school because she was good at it, traveled to Whispering Pines because she had no other choice. None of it had felt like courage, just survival, just doing the next right thing. But maybe that's what courage was. Not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. Not knowing you'd succeed, but trying anyway. Not having guarantees, but taking the risk because the alternative, staying frozen, staying safe, staying alone, was worse than any possible failure. She was locking the schoolhouse when Rowan appeared, leading his horse through the snow. He'd clearly gone home and cleaned up. His hair was damp, his face freshly shaved, and he wore a clean shirt under his heavy coat. In his free hand, he carried a covered basket. "Evening," he said, that slight smile playing at his lips. "Brought dinner like I promised, and—" He hesitated, suddenly looking uncertain. "If you've changed your mind, if last night was too much too fast, I understand. We can just be friends, Margaret. I won't push for more than you're ready to give." She looked at him, really looked at him. This man who'd ridden to a train station to rescue a stranger, who'd spent his evenings building desks for children who weren't his own, who'd served time in prison and emerged determined to be better than his worst moment, who loved her with a patience and gentleness that made her feel safe enough to love him back. "I haven't changed my mind," she said, "and I'm ready to give more than friendship, Rowan. I'm ready to see where this goes, even though it scares me, especially because it scares me." His expression transformed, relief and joy chasing away the uncertainty. "Then let's get you inside before we both freeze. I've got Jimmy's pot roast and it's actually hot for once." They ate at her small table, the lamp casting warm light over the simple meal. The conversation flowed easily at first, talk of her school day, his work on the ranch, the plans for his new land, but gradually it deepened into territory they'd skirted around before. "Tell me about your marriage," Rowan said. "About Thomas. I want to know who he was, what he meant to you. I don't want to be competing with a memory I know nothing about." Margaret took a breath, then began talking. She told him about meeting Thomas at a church social, how he'd been shy and bookish and completely different from the other young men who'd pursued her, how he'd courted her with poetry and long walks, with conversations about books and dreams and the kind of life they wanted to build together, how their marriage had been quiet but happy, full of small domestic joys, Sunday breakfasts, reading aloud to each other, planning for children who never came. Then she told him about the illness, the slow, horrible decline, the way Thomas had apologized for dying, as though he'd chosen to abandon her, the funeral she couldn't afford, and the emptiness that followed, so vast and complete she'd thought she'd never feel whole again. "I loved him," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I loved him completely, and part of me will always love him, will always carry him with me. But Constance was right. Hearts don't have limited capacity. I can love Thomas's memory and still have room to love someone new, to love you." Rowan reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I'm not trying to replace him, Margaret. I couldn't if I wanted to. He was your husband, your first love, part of your history. I'm hoping I can be part of your future, if you'll let me." "I want that," Margaret whispered. "I want a future, with you. I need time to figure out how to do this, how to honor what I had while building something new. We'll figure it out together. No rush, no pressure, he smiled slightly. "Just two people who got knocked down by life and decided to help each other get back up." They talked late into the night, sharing histories and hopes, fears and dreams. Rowan told her about his childhood in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the war that had taken so many men from his town, about his brother Sam and the dreams they'd shared, the plans that died with him, about prison and the darkness he'd found there, both in the physical confinement and in his own soul. "I was so angry," he said. "Angry at God for taking Sam, angry at the world for being unfair, angry at myself for not being good enough to save him somehow. That's what led me to stealing those horses. I was trying to punish the world because I couldn't punish the fate that took my brother. But you found your way back. With help. Mrs. Hawkins saw something in me I couldn't see in myself. She gave me work and purpose and dignity when I had none. Taught me that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a future worth having despite it." He looked at Margaret with those pale eyes that saw too much. "Kind of like what you're doing now, building a future even though the past still hurts." As the fire burned low and the hour grew late, Rowan finally stood to leave. At the door, he paused, turning back to face her. Margaret, I want to ask you something, but you can say no if it's too soon. Christmas is in 3 weeks. Would you consider coming to the Christmas Eve service with me? Not as friends, as more than friends. Let people see we're courting if that's what we're doing. Margaret's breath caught. Going to church together at Christmas would be a public declaration, a statement that she was moving on from widowhood into something new. The town would talk, would judge, would have opinions about whether 9 months was too soon to be seen with another man. But she thought about Thomas's voice saying, "I want you to be happy." About Constance's words, "Ma, life is too short to waste being proper." About her own realization that courage meant moving forward despite fear. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll go with you. I'd be honored to go with you." His smile could have lit the whole valley. "Thank you for trusting me with this. With you. I promise I'll make you glad you took the chance." "You already have," Margaret said softly. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. School continued, with Margaret's students making decorations for the Christmas celebration the town was planning. Sarah Morrison was nearly finished with her first medical text and had begun corresponding with a nursing school in Denver, her letters full of cautious hope. Miguel Santangelo had decided he wanted to become an engineer and was devouring every mathematics book Margaret could find. Rosita had written a poem about winter in both Spanish and English that was so beautiful, Margaret sent it to a newspaper in Santa Fe, hoping they might publish it. And through it all, Rowan was there. They were careful to maintain propriety. No unchaperoned evenings alone, no physical contact beyond hand-holding, nothing that would compromise Margaret's reputation. But everyone in town could see what was developing between them. And to Margaret's surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. "About time that boy found someone worthy of him," old Pete said, wrapping packages at the general store. "And about time someone saw past that prison record to the man he's become." "You two look at each other like characters in one of those romance novels," Maria Santangelo teased, her eyes warm with approval. "Young love is beautiful, even when it comes the second time around." Even Jack Morrison, Sarah's grieving father, stopped Margaret after church one Sunday and said quietly, "My wife died 3 years ago, and I still can't imagine loving anyone else. But I'm glad you can. Glad you're brave enough to try again. Life's too hard to face it alone." Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and fresh snow that made whispering pines look like something from a storybook. The church was decorated with pine boughs and candles, and the whole town gathered for the evening service. Margaret wore her best dress, still black, but with a shawl of deep blue that Constance had given her, saying, "You've mourned long enough in unrelieved black. Thomas wouldn't want you to wear darkness forever." Rowan appeared at her door in the early twilight, dressed in what must have been his best clothes, dark pants, a clean white shirt, a vest that brought out the blue of his eyes. He looked nervous and hopeful, and so handsome that Margaret's breath caught. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "Ready?" "Ready?" she confirmed, taking his offered arm. They walked through town together, and Margaret felt the weight of people's eyes on them, curious, assessing, but not unkind. This was it, she realized. This was the moment she stopped being the poor widow from St. Louis and became Margaret Hale of Whispering Pines, teacher and woman with a future that didn't belong to the past. The church service was beautiful, carols sung by voices rough but sincere, the Reverend's sermon about hope and new beginnings, the sense of community that filled the small space with warmth despite the cold night outside. Margaret sat beside Rowan, their shoulders touching, her hand in his, and felt something settle deep in her chest. Peace, she realized. This was peace. The ability to remember Thomas with love while still opening her heart to new possibilities. The knowledge that grief and joy could coexist, that honoring the past didn't mean sacrificing the future. After the service, as people milled around exchanging Christmas greetings and sharing food that had been brought for the celebration, Rowan drew Margaret aside to a quiet corner. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his vest pocket. "It's not much, and I wasn't sure if it was too soon, but I needed you to know how serious I am about this, about us." He pulled out a small wooden box, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a ring,
a simple gold band set with a small perfect pearl. It was my mother's, Rowan said, his voice rough with emotion. The only thing I have from my family. Sam gave it to me before he died, said I should save it for someone worth keeping, someone who saw past my mistakes to who I could be. He looked at her, his pale eyes bright with unshed tears. Margaret Hale, I know it soon. I know people will say we're rushing, that you should wait longer, that I'm not good enough for you. And maybe they're right. But I also know that life is short and love is rare, and when you find someone who makes you want to be better than you are, you don't let them go just because the timing isn't perfect. He took a breath, steadying himself. So I'm asking, will you marry me? Not right away if you're not ready. We can wait as long as you need, have a long engagement, do everything proper and respectable. But I want you to know that I'm committed to this, to you, to building a life together. I want to wake up every morning knowing I get to see you, to talk to you, to help you with your teaching and your dreams. I want to be the man who holds you when you're sad and celebrates with you when you're happy. I want everything, Margaret, with you. Margaret stared at the ring, at this man who'd ridden to a train station 3 months ago to rescue a stranger and had somehow become essential to her existence. 9 months ago, she'd been standing by Thomas's grave thinking her life was over. Now she was standing in a church in a town she'd never heard of, being proposed to by a reformed horse thief with poet's eyes and patient hands, and feeling more alive than she'd felt in years. Yes, she said, the word coming out steady and sure despite the tears streaming down her face. Yes, Rowan Pierce, I will marry you. Not because it's sensible or proper or the right amount of time has passed, but because you make me believe in second chances and new beginnings. Because you see me, really see me, and decided I was worth waiting for at a train station. Because when I'm with you, I remember what hope feels like. His hands shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the pearl catching the candlelight, and Margaret thought about how strange fate was. How losing everything in St. Louis had led her to Cedar Springs. How missing that train had put her on Rowan's path. How rejection and desperation had ultimately brought her to exactly where she needed to be. They kissed then, soft and gentle, a promise of things to come. Around them, the church had gone quiet, and when they finally broke apart, Margaret realized the entire town had been watching. For a moment she felt a flutter of embarrassment, but then Sarah Morrison started clapping and others joined in, and suddenly the whole church was applauding, celebrating, welcoming this union between their teacher and the man who'd proven redemption was possible. Constance Hawkins pushed through the crowd, her weathered face bright with joy. "About damn time," she said, pulling them both into a fierce hug. "I've been waiting for this since the day Rowan came back from Cedar Springs with that look on his face, the one that said he'd met someone who mattered. You two are going to be very happy together. I'll make sure of it." The celebration lasted late into the night, the whole town rejoicing in this evidence that good things could happen even in hard times. Margaret was hugged and congratulated by everyone, children and adults, alike expressing their happiness for her. Even Jack Morrison, that grief-stricken father, managed to smile and said, "Your husband would be happy for you. Real love wants the beloved to be happy, even if you can't be the one making them so." It was nearly midnight when Rowan finally walked Margaret home, both of them exhausted but exhilarated. At her door, he held her hands and said, "We should talk about timing. When do you want to marry? Spring? Summer? Whenever you're ready, I'll wait." Margaret thought about it, about propriety and mourning periods and what society said was appropriate. Then she thought about Thomas's voice saying, "Promise me you'll be happy," about Constance's wisdom that grief doesn't follow schedules, about her own growing certainty that love found was too precious to postpone. "New Year's Day," she said. "Let's start the new year as husband and wife. Start 1879 with a marriage that represents new beginnings and second chances, if that's not too soon." Rowan's smile was brilliant. "It's perfect, absolutely perfect. We'll have Reverend Matthews perform the ceremony, and Mrs. Z. Hawkins can host it at the ranch, and your students can be there to celebrate with us." "Our students," Margaret corrected gently. "They'll be our students, Rowan. Our children to teach and guide and help grow. That's what we're building here. Not just a marriage, but a life that matters, a life that makes a difference." "Our students," he repeated, testing the words. "Our life, our future."
He pulled her close, holding her against his chest where she could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong. Thank you, Margaret, for taking a chance on a man with a past, for seeing who I could be instead of who I was, for loving me when I was just learning how to love myself. Thank you for riding to that station, Margaret whispered, for saying you'd been waiting for me when I thought nobody would ever want me again, for building desks and carrying firewood and being patient while I figured out it was okay to be happy, for being exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it. They stood there in the cold night, holding each other under a sky full of stars, and Margaret thought about the strange, winding path that had brought her here. Every loss, every rejection, every moment of despair had been necessary to lead her to this place, this man, this life that felt like it had been waiting for her all along. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a flurry of preparation. Margaret continued teaching, though her students were more interested in discussing her upcoming wedding than in mathematics or reading. Constance Hawkins took charge of arrangements with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops, organizing food and decorations and making sure everyone in town knew they were invited to celebrate. This isn't just about you and Rowan, she explained to Margaret. It's about the whole community. You're our teacher, he's one of our own, and your marriage represents what Whispering Pines is all about, giving people second chances and celebrating when they make good on them. Sarah Morrison, with Margaret's permission, took charge of making a wedding dress. She enlisted the help of several town women, and they worked in secret, creating something beautiful from yards of cream-colored fabric that old Pete somehow produced from his seemingly limitless store inventory. On New Year's Eve, the night before the wedding, Margaret stood in her small house looking at the dress they'd created. It was simple but elegant, with long sleeves and a high collar, delicate embroidery at the cuffs and hem. Not white, that would have been too presumptuous for a second marriage, but cream, the color of new beginnings and cautious hope. A knock at the door interrupted her reflection. She opened it to find Constance Hawkins, carrying a wooden box. "Thought you might like some company on your last night as a single woman," Constance said, settling into a chair. "Brought you something, too." She opened the box to reveal a delicate lace veil, yellowed slightly with age, but beautiful. "This was mine, for my first wedding. My husband's mother made it, spent months on the lacework. I wore it when I married, and I'd be honored if you'd wear it tomorrow. Every bride should have something old, something borrowed, something blue. This covers old and borrowed." Margaret felt tears threaten again. She'd been so emotional these past weeks, crying at the smallest kindnesses. "It's beautiful. Are you sure?" "I'm sure. You're like a daughter to me, Margaret. The daughter I never had. Seeing you happy, seeing you and Rowan building a life together, it's one of my greatest joys." Constance paused, her expression growing more serious. "I want to tell you something about marriage, something I learned from my own. It's not always easy. There will be days when you're frustrated with each other, when you wonder if you made a mistake. But on those days, remember why you chose each other. Remember that you both know what it's like to lose, to grieve, to start over. That shared understanding will carry you through the hard times. Did you ever regret it? Marrying your husband? Not for a single second. We had 15 years together before his heart gave out, and every one of those years was a gift. I still miss him every day, but I've never regretted loving him, even though losing him hurt more than I can say." She smiled. "Love is always worth the risk, Margaret. Always." After Constance left, Margaret lay in bed thinking about Thomas. She pulled out the small daguerreotype she kept of him, studying his gentle face, his serious eyes, his slight smile. He looked so young in the picture, so full of hope and plans for their future together. "I'm getting married tomorrow," she told the photograph softly, "to a man named Rowan Pierce. He's good and kind and patient, and he makes me happy. I think you'd like him, Thomas. I think you'd approve." She paused, tears sliding down her temples into her hair. "I'm not forgetting you. I could never forget you. You were my first love, my first husband, the man who taught me what marriage could be. But you're gone, and I'm still here, and I need to keep living. I need to let myself love again." She set the photograph on her small table, propped where she could see it. Tomorrow she'd marry Rowan, but tonight belonged to memory and gratitude and saying goodbye to the life she'd thought she'd have, so she could fully embrace the life she'd actually been given. New Year's Day, 1879, dawned clear and cold, the kind of perfect winter morning that made everything seem possible. Margaret woke early, nervous and excited in equal measure. Sarah Morrison arrived with several other women to help her dress, their chatter filling her small house with warmth and joy. "You look like a princess," little Rosita Santangelo breathed when Margaret was finally dressed, the cream-colored gown fitting perfectly, Constance's veil adding an ethereal quality to her appearance. "I feel like one," Margaret admitted, studying her reflection. She looked different than she had on her first wedding day, older, certainly, but also somehow more herself, more sure of who she was and what she wanted. The woman in the mirror had been broken and had chosen to heal, had lost everything and had found the courage to build something new, had loved and grieved and learned to love again. The ceremony was held at the Hawkins Ranch, in the large main room where furniture had been pushed back to make space for everyone. The whole town crowded in, children sitting on the floor in front, adults standing or sitting in whatever chairs could be found. Someone had decorated with pine boughs and winter berries, and a fire roared in the massive fireplace, making the room warm despite the January cold outside. Margaret stood in a small back room with Constance and Sarah, waiting for her cue to enter. Through the door, she could hear the murmur of voices, the occasional laugh, the sense of community gathering to celebrate. "Ready?" Constance asked, squeezing her hand. "Ready," Margaret confirmed, and meant it with her whole heart. She entered the main room on Constance's arm, and everything else fell away except Rowan standing at the front, next to Reverend Matthews. He wore dark pants and a white shirt, his best vest, his hair neatly combed but already showing signs of trying to escape its discipline. His face when he saw her was everything, awe and joy and love and gratitude all mixed together, his pale eyes bright with emotion. The ceremony was simple and beautiful, traditional vows that took on new meaning when spoken by two people who'd both known loss, who both understood that promises of for better or worse weren't just words but actual commitments to stay, even when things got hard. When Rowan said, "Till death do us part," his voice caught, and Margaret squeezed his hands, reminding him that this time, right now, they were both alive and choosing each other. When Reverend Matthews finally said, "You may kiss your bride," Rowan pulled Margaret close and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart overflow. Around them, the town erupted in applause and cheers, children whooping, adults wiping away happy tears. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Matthews announced, his voice carrying over the celebration, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Rowan Pierce." The celebration that followed was joyous and chaotic. There was food enough to feed an army, roasted meats and fresh bread, pies and cakes, vegetables preserved from summer gardens, coffee and cider flowing freely. The furniture was pushed even further back and someone produced a fiddle, and soon people were dancing, the music filling the ranch house with life and laughter. Margaret danced with Rowan first, neither of them particularly skilled, but both delighted to be in each other's arms. Then she danced with Jack Morrison, who thanked her again for believing in his daughter, with old Pete, who told her she'd made the whole town proud, with each of her students' fathers, these men who'd trusted her with their children's education and were now celebrating her happiness. As evening fell and the party showed no signs of slowing, Rowan pulled Margaret aside to a quiet corner of the porch where they could catch their breath. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder.
"Happier than I ever thought I'd be again," Margaret said honestly, leaning back against him. 3 months ago, I was standing on a train platform thinking my life was over. Now I'm married to a man I love, teaching children who matter to me, part of a community that accepts me exactly as I am. It's almost too much happiness. I keep waiting for something to go wrong." "Nothing's going to go wrong," Rowan said firmly. "Or if it does, we'll face it together. That's what marriage means. You're not alone anymore. Whatever comes, we handle it side by side." Inside, someone called for the bride and groom to make a toast, and they returned to find glasses being raised, faces turned toward them expectantly. Rowan looked at Margaret, asking silent permission, and when she nodded, he raised his glass and spoke in a voice that carried through the crowded room. "I'm not much for speeches," he began. "Most of you know my past, know I made mistakes that cost me years of my life. I thought I'd never deserve good things, never be worthy of respect or trust.
Then Mrs. Hawkins gave me a chance when nobody else would, and I learned that redemption is possible if you're willing to work for it. He turned to look at Margaret, his expression softening. And then I rode to a train station in Cedar Springs to meet a woman I'd never seen before, and my whole world changed. Margaret, you saw past my mistakes to the man I was trying to become. You believed in me when I barely believed in myself. You taught me that love doesn't require perfection, just honesty and effort, and the courage to try again even when you've been hurt before. He raised his glass higher. So here's to second chances and new beginnings. To the people who help us become better than we thought we could be. To communities that take care of their own. And to my wife. His voice caught slightly on the word, as though he still couldn't quite believe it was real. Who makes me grateful every single day that she missed that train to Tucson. The room erupted in cheers and applause, glasses clinking, people calling out their own toasts and blessings. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the love and support surrounding them, by the evidence that she and Rowan had somehow become symbols of hope for this entire community of second chancers and survivors. Later, much later, when the party had finally wound down and most people had headed home through the cold night, Rowan and Margaret stood outside the small house that was now theirs. Not Margaret's alone anymore, but theirs, a space they would share, where they would build their life together. I have one more gift for you, Rowan said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. Mrs. Hawkins gave it to me this morning. The deed to our 100 acres. She said it should be in both our names, that we're partners in everything now. So it's official. We own land, Margaret. We have a place to build our ranch, to raise horses, to create something that lasts. Margaret took the deed with trembling hands, seeing their names written together. Rowan and Margaret Pierce. A partnership, a union, a future they'd build side by side. I love you, she said, the words coming easily now, without the guilt and fear that had colored them before. I love you for who you are and who we are together, for believing in second chances and teaching me to believe in them too. I love you, Rowan echoed, pulling her close. Thank you for taking a chance on a reformed horse thief with a past. Thank you for seeing possibility where everyone else saw problems. Thank you for being brave enough to love again. They went inside together, closing the door on the cold night and opening it on their new life. And as Margaret settled into Rowan's arms in the bed they would now share, she thought about the strange winding path that had brought her here. How rejection had led to rescue. How loss had led to love. How the worst day of her life, standing rejected on that train platform, had actually been the beginning of everything good that followed. Spring came early that year, bringing warmth and new growth to the valley. Margaret continued teaching, her students thriving under her guidance. Sarah Morrison was accepted to nursing school and would leave in the fall, her dreams finally within reach. Rosita's poem was published in the Santa Fe newspaper, and she was already working on more, her confidence growing with each word she wrote. Miguel had started corresponding with an engineering professor who was giving him advanced problems to solve, preparing him for eventual university study. And on the 100 acres they now owned, Rowan began building. Not just a house, though that came first, a sturdy structure with 2 bedrooms and a real kitchen and windows that looked out over the valley, but also a barn for the horses he'd start raising, corrals for training, a small stable that would eventually hold the finest quarter horses in the territory. Margaret helped when school allowed, holding boards while Rowan hammered, discussing plans and dreams, imagining the life they'd create here. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she thought about Thomas. The grief was still there, but it had transformed into something gentler, not a wound anymore, but a scar. A reminder of love lost, but also of love that had been real and good and worth having, even though it ended. By summer, when the house was finished and they could finally move in, Margaret was pregnant. She told Rowan one evening as they sat on their new porch watching the sun set over the mountains, and his expression cycled through shock and joy and wonder so quickly she almost laughed. A baby, he whispered, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. Our baby. Margaret, how do you feel? Are you well? Do you need anything? I feel wonderful, she assured him, covering his hand with hers. A little tired, a little overwhelmed, but mostly just happy. We're going to be parents, Rowan. We're going to raise a child in this beautiful place, teach them everything we know, give them all the love we have.
That fall, as the aspens turned gold and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter, Margaret stood in her schoolhouse, now equipped with proper desks for every student, a real chalkboard, shelves full of books, and looked at her students' faces. Some were the same children who'd been there that first day. Others were new, families having moved to Whispering Pines after hearing about the good school and the welcoming community.
Sarah Morrison had left for Denver and nursing school, but she wrote regularly, her letters full of excitement about what she was learning and gratitude for the teacher who'd believed in her dreams. Rosita was writing a book of poems that might actually be published. Miguel was already planning to apply to engineering schools. And all 19 original students had progressed beyond what anyone thought possible for children in a small frontier town. As she dismissed class that Friday afternoon, watching her students scatter into the golden autumn light, Margaret felt Rowan's arms wrap around her from behind, his hands settling protectively over her now obvious pregnancy. "Good day?" he asked, his voice warm against her ear. "The best," she said, leaning back against him. "The absolute best." They walked home together, past the church where they'd married, past the general store where old Pete waved from the doorway, past the houses of families they now knew and loved. Their own house came into view, smoke rising from its chimney where she'd banked the fire that morning, lamplight already glowing in the windows because Rowan had stopped home first to start dinner. "You know what today is?" Margaret asked as they climbed the porch steps. "Friday? It's been exactly 1 year since I stood on that train platform in Cedar Springs. 1 year since I thought my life was ending." She turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. 1 year since a cowboy rode up and said he'd been waiting for me. Rowan pulled her close, one hand cradling her face, the other resting protectively on their child growing inside her. "Best day of my life meeting you. Every day since has been better than the one before." "Even the hard days?" Margaret asked, thinking of the challenges they'd faced. The early misunderstanding when they were learning how to be married. The skepticism from a few townspeople who thought a widow shouldn't remarry so quickly. The difficulties of building a ranch and a life from nothing. "Especially the hard days," Rowan said firmly. "Because even on the hard days, I get to face them with you. That makes all the difference." As they went inside, Margaret thought about how far she'd traveled. Not just the physical distance from St. Louis to Arizona territory, but the emotional journey from despair to hope, from widow to wife, from someone who'd lost everything to someone who'd found more than she'd ever dreamed possible. She thought about Thomas, buried in St. Louis beneath a simple granite stone, about how he'd made her promise to be happy, and how she'd finally learned what that meant. Not forgetting him or pretending their love hadn't mattered, but honoring it by living fully, loving bravely, choosing joy even when fear tried to hold her back. She thought about the children she taught, the lives she touched, the difference she made in this small community of second chancers and survivors. About Sarah pursuing her dreams in Denver, about Rosita's poems finding readers, about Miguel's future as an engineer, about the child she carried, who would be born into a home filled with love and purpose and the kind of belonging that transformed people. And she thought about the man beside her, this reformed horse thief who'd ridden to a train station because a woman he'd never met needed rescuing, who'd built desks for children who weren't his, who loved her with a patience and gentleness that made her believe in second chances. That night, as they lay in bed with Rowan's hand resting on her pregnant belly and the wind whispering through the pines outside their window, Margaret whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." "For what?" Rowan murmured sleepily. "For waiting for me. For finding me when I was lost. For showing me that endings can become beginnings if you're brave enough to let them." His arms tightened around her. "Thank you for being worth waiting for teaching me that redemption is real and love is always worth the risk, for choosing me when you could have chosen safe." They drifted to sleep wrapped in each other's arms, and outside the wind continued its ancient song through the whispering pines, telling the story of two souls who'd lost everything and found each other. Of a widow who'd been rejected at a station, and a cowboy who'd ridden up to say, "I've been waiting for you." Was son. Of how sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to everything good that follows, if we're just brave enough to walk through them. And in that small house on 100 acres of Arizona territory land, surrounded by mountains and pine trees, and a community that had become family, Margaret and Rowan Pierce slept peacefully, knowing they'd found what everyone searches for but so few actually discover: a place to belong, work that mattered, people who needed them, and love that was worth every risk and every fear it took to claim it. The story wasn't over, of course. There would be challenges ahead: the baby's birth, the ranch's growth, the inevitable difficulties of life in a hard land. But they would face it all together, side by side. Two people who'd learned that second chances were real and happy endings were possible even after the worst beginnings. And on quiet evenings, when Margaret stood on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, she would think about that train platform in Cedar Springs, about standing there alone and desperate, thinking she'd lost her last chance at a meaningful life, about the sound of hoofbeats approaching and a stranger's voice saying he'd been waiting for her. She would smile, placing her hand on her growing belly, and whisper to the child inside, "Sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you were really meant to have all along. And sometimes, when you're standing at your lowest point thinking there's no way forward, that's exactly when your future rides up on horseback and says it's been waiting for you." The wind would catch her words and carry them away into the valley, mixing with the whisper of the pines, adding her story to all the other stories of loss and redemption that made up the history of Whispering Pines. And the mountains would stand witness, as they had for thousands of years, to one more human finding their way home.